The collapse of Teotihuacan around 650 AD created a power vacuum across central Mexico that would take centuries to fill. As the great metropolis fell into decline, its population scattered across the basin of Mexico and beyond, carrying with them fragments of knowledge, artistic traditions, and political structures that would eventually coalesce into new civilizations. Among these emerging groups, the Toltecs would rise to become the dominant force in Mesoamerica, but their origins lay not in sudden conquest or divine mandate, but in the gradual accumulation of peoples, ideas, and material innovations across the Mexican highlands. Archaeological evidence from the early 10th century reveals a complex pattern of settlement and cultural development that challenges earlier assumptions about Toltec origins. Rather than emerging as a unified ethnic group, the early Toltecs represented a confederation of related peoples who shared linguistic roots, religious practices, and material technologies. Excavations at sites throughout the basin of Mexico have uncovered ceramic assemblages that show clear continuities with late Teotihuacan traditions, while simultaneously displaying innovations that would become hallmarks of Toltec culture. These vessels, characterized by their distinctive orange and red slip decorations, geometric patterns, and new vessel forms including tripod bowls with solid supports, mark the emergence of a distinct material culture that would spread across central Mexico. The ceramic evidence is particularly revealing when examining the gradual shift in production techniques and decorative motifs. Early Toltec pottery shows sophisticated understanding of firing temperatures and clay preparation, suggesting that craftsmen had access to established workshops and maintained contact with other ceramic-producing regions. The appearance of Mazapan red-on-buff ceramics around 900 AD provides archaeologists with a clear marker for early Toltec occupation. These vessels, decorated with geometric designs including step fret motifs, parallel lines, and stylized animal forms, represent a departure from Teotihuacan's more naturalistic artistic traditions, while maintaining technical excellence in their manufacture. Stone tool assemblages from early Toltec sites demonstrate sophisticated lithic technology that built upon centuries of Mesoamerican innovation. Obsidian blade production reached new levels of efficiency during this period, with evidence suggesting that Toltec craftsmen had access to high-quality obsidian sources in the Sierra de las Navajas and Otumba regions. The standardization of blade production techniques, visible in the consistent dimensions and edge angles of recovered specimens, indicates organized workshops operating under centralized control. Projectile points from this period show refinements in hafting technology and aerodynamic design that would prove crucial in later military campaigns. The linguistic composition of early Toltec groups presents a complex picture that reflects the multi-ethnic nature of post-Teotihuacan central Mexico. While Nahuatl-speaking populations formed the core of Toltec identity, archaeological and ethno-historical evidence suggests significant participation by speakers of Otomi, Mazawa, and other central Mexican languages. This linguistic diversity created a cosmopolitan environment that fostered technological innovation and cultural synthesis. Nahuatl place names from the period, preserved in later colonial documents, provide insight into the geographic extent of early Toltec settlement and the ways in which these groups conceptualized their relationship to the landscape. The process of Toltec ethnogenesis involved the gradual integration of diverse populations under increasingly centralized political structures. Rather than conquest or displacement, this integration appears to have occurred through intermarriage, shared ritual practices, and economic cooperation. Archaeological evidence from residential compounds shows mixed material assemblages that suggest households included individuals from different cultural backgrounds. The presence of Teotihuacan-style figurines, alongside early Toltec ceramic forms, indicates that cultural traditions were preserved and transformed rather than abandoned wholesale. Settlement patterns during the early Toltec period reveal a strategic approach to territorial control and resource exploitation that would characterize their later imperial expansion. Unlike the concentrated urban model of Teotihuacan, early Toltec settlements adopted a distributed pattern that maximized access to diverse ecological zones while maintaining defensive advantages. Sites were typically established on elevated terrain overlooking river valleys, providing both agricultural potential and strategic visibility. The spacing between major settlements suggests a coordinated approach to territorial organization, with each center controlling approximately 20 kilometers of surrounding territory. The establishment of Tolentzicoquetitlan as the primary Toltec center represents one of the most significant urban planning achievements of early Mesoamerica. Located in modern-day Tula, Hidalgo, approximately 65 kilometers north of Mexico City, the site was chosen for its strategic position controlling trade routes between the basin of Mexico and the northern frontiers. The Tula River provided a reliable water source and fertile alluvial soils, while the surrounding hills offered defensive positions and access to limestone quarries that would supply construction materials for monumental architecture. Early construction at Tolentzicoquetitlan followed a carefully planned urban layout that reflected both practical considerations and cosmological principles. The site's ceremonial core was oriented approximately 17 degrees east of north, an alignment that connected the city to important astronomical events while distinguishing it from earlier Teotihuacan traditions. Initial construction phases focused on establishing basic infrastructure, including residential areas, workshops, and storage facilities, before beginning work on the monumental architecture that would later define the site. Archaeological investigations have revealed that the earliest occupation at Tula began around 900 AD, with small-scale settlements concentrated along the river terraces. These initial communities consisted of modest residential structures built using local stone and adobe, with thatched roofs supported by wooden posts. The houses typically measured 6 meters on each side, and were arranged around small courtyards that served as work areas and storage spaces. Evidence from these early contexts includes grinding stones for food preparation, spindle whorls indicating textile production, and ceramic vessels for cooking and storage. The transition from village-level organization to urban center occurred gradually over the first half of the 10th century. Population growth, evidenced by the expansion of residential areas and increased density of artifact deposits, coincided with the construction of more substantial civic and religious architecture. The first monumental buildings at Tula were relatively modest structures that served as prototypes for the massive pyramids and palaces that would later dominate the site. These early public buildings utilized a distinctive architectural style that combined elements from various Mesoamerican traditions while introducing innovations that would become characteristic of Toltec construction. The economic foundation of early Toltec society rested on agricultural intensification and craft specialization that built upon centuries of Mesoamerican innovation. Evidence from agricultural terraces and irrigation systems around Tula demonstrates sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering and soil management. The construction of check dams and canal systems allowed Toltec farmers to maximize productivity in the semi-arid environment of central Mexico, while reducing the risk of crop failure during periodic droughts. Craft production during the early Toltec period shows clear evidence of specialization and standardization that suggests organized workshop systems. Obsidian tool production, in particular, reached new levels of efficiency and quality control. Analysis of debitage from workshop areas reveals standardized reduction sequences and consistent blade dimensions that indicate master craftsmen were training apprentices in established techniques. The distribution of finished tools throughout residential areas suggests that craft specialists were producing goods for both local consumption and regional exchange. Metallurgical evidence from early Toltec contexts provides the first clear documentation of copperworking in central Mexico. While metal objects remain relatively rare in 10th century deposits, the presence of copper bells, needles, and decorative elements indicates that Toltec craftsmen had established contact with metal-producing regions to the west. The technical knowledge required for copper smelting and casting represents a significant technological advancement that would later contribute to Toltec military and economic advantages. The religious and ideological foundations of Toltec civilization began to crystallize during this formative period through the synthesis of diverse Mesoamerican traditions. Archaeological evidence from early ceremonial contexts at Tula reveals the adoption and adaptation of religious practices from throughout central Mexico. Offerings buried beneath building foundations include jade ornaments, obsidian blades, and ceramic vessels that demonstrate continuity with earlier Mesoamerican ritual traditions, while showing distinctive Toltec innovations in form and symbolism. The iconographic program that would later characterize Toltec art and architecture began to emerge during the early 10th century through the gradual development of standardized symbolic systems. Stone sculptures and ceramic decorations from this period show the early development of motifs that would become central to Toltec religious and political ideology. The feathered serpent, jaguar warriors, and eagle imagery that would later dominate Toltec art appear in simplified forms on early ceramics and small-scale sculptures. Trade networks established during the early Toltec period laid the foundation for the extensive commercial systems that would later support their imperial expansion. Archaeological evidence indicates that by 950 AD, Toltec merchants had established regular contact with regions throughout Mesoamerica. Imported materials found in early Toltec contexts include marine shells from both Pacific and Gulf coasts, jade from Guatemala, and obsidian from sources throughout central and western Mexico. The presence of these exotic materials in both elite and commoner contexts suggests that trade was not restricted to luxury goods, but included everyday items and raw materials. The political organization of early Toltec society appears to have been based on a combination of kinship ties, religious authority, and military leadership that would evolve into the complex state system of later periods. Evidence from residential architecture suggests the emergence of social stratification, with larger and more elaborate houses associated with higher status individuals. However, the differences in wealth and status during this early period were relatively modest compared to later Toltec society, suggesting that political hierarchy was still in the process of development. The transformation of the modest riverside settlements at Tula into the magnificent urban centre of Tolon-Xicocoatitlan represents one of the most remarkable achievements in Mesoamerican urban planning. By 950 AD, the population had grown to an estimated 15,000, 20,000 inhabitants, necessitating a complete reorganization of the settlement's spatial structure and the implementation of sophisticated infrastructure systems. The architects and planners who oversaw this transformation drew upon centuries of Mesoamerican urban design experience, while introducing innovations that would influence city planning throughout central Mexico for generations to come. The master plan for Tolon-Xicocoatitlan reflected a sophisticated understanding of both practical urban needs and cosmological principles that governed Mesoamerican city design. The planners divided the urban area into distinct functional zones connected by a network of paved causeways and drainage systems that managed seasonal flooding while facilitating movement of goods and people. The ceremonial precinct occupied the highest ground at the centre of the city, surrounded by elite residential compounds that housed the ruling families and their retainers. Craft production areas were strategically located near raw material sources and transportation routes, while agricultural processing facilities were positioned along the river terraces, where hydraulic systems could efficiently manage water flow. The construction of Toltecs required unprecedented coordination of labour and resources that demonstrates the emergence of powerful centralised authority. Archaeological evidence indicates that construction crews worked simultaneously on multiple projects throughout the city, suggesting that planners had developed sophisticated project management systems. Stone quarries in the surrounding hills show evidence of systematic extraction using bronze tools and wooden wedges, with finished blocks transported to construction sites via wooden rollers and rope systems. The consistency of construction techniques across different areas of the city indicates that master builders had established standardized procedures and trained teams of specialized workers. The architectural innovations introduced at Toltecs represented a significant departure from earlier Mesoamerican building traditions, while incorporating elements from diverse regional styles. Toltec architects developed a distinctive approach to monumental construction that emphasized horizontal lines and geometric precision over the more organic forms characteristic of earlier periods. Buildings were constructed using a core of rubble and mortar, faced with carefully fitted stone blocks, creating structures that were both durable and aesthetically impressive. The use of standardized block sizes and modular construction techniques allowed builders to create complex architectural compositions while maintaining structural integrity. The most spectacular architectural achievement of this period was the construction of the Great Temple complex known today as Pyramid B, which served as the focal point of the ceremonial precinct. Rising to a height of approximately 10 meters, this step pyramid represented a synthesis of architectural traditions from throughout Mesoamerica while introducing distinctively Toltec innovations. The structure's base measured 40 by 40 meters, with each of its 5 ascending levels decorated with relief sculptures depicting jaguars, eagles, and coyotes consuming human hearts. These carved panels, executed with remarkable precision and artistic sophistication, established iconographic themes that would become central to Toltec religious and political ideology. The temple that crowned Pyramid B housed one of the most innovative architectural features of the Toltec period, the famous Atlantean columns that supported the roof of the sanctuary. These massive stone sculptures, each standing 4.6 meters tall and carved from single blocks of basalt, represented Toltec warriors in full battle regalia. The figures wore feathered headdresses, butterfly-shaped pectorals, and carried atlatls and bundles of darts, their stern faces gazing eternally toward the plaza below. The technical achievement represented by these sculptures was extraordinary, requiring not only artistic skill but also sophisticated understanding of structural engineering to create columns that could support the massive stone roof beams while maintaining their sculptural integrity. The carving of the Atlantean columns required specialized tools and techniques that demonstrate the advanced state of Toltec stoneworking technology. Archaeological evidence from workshop areas reveals that sculptors used bronze chisels, stone hammers, and abrasive materials to shape the hard basalt into precise forms. The consistency of proportions and decorative details across all 4 columns indicates that craftsmen worked from established templates or models, suggesting a level of artistic standardization previously unknown in Mesoamerica. The transportation and erection of these massive sculptures required sophisticated engineering, with evidence suggesting that builders used ramps, pulleys, and lever systems to position the columns with millimeter precision. Adjacent to the Great Temple, construction of the Temple of Tlahuizcalpantecutli represented another significant architectural innovation that would influence temple design throughout Mesoamerica. This structure, dedicated to the deity associated with Venus as the morning star, featured a unique combination of architectural elements that reflected both astronomical observations and religious symbolism. The temple's orientation was precisely calculated to align with the heliosol rising of Venus, demonstrating the sophisticated astronomical knowledge possessed by Toltec priest astronomers. The building's facade was decorated with elaborate relief sculptures depicting the feathered serpent, Venus symbols, and scenes of ritual sacrifice that communicated complex theological concepts to both elite and commoner audiences. The interior of the temple of Tlahuizcalpantecutli contained specialized architectural features designed to enhance religious ceremonies and astronomical observations. The main sanctuary included carefully positioned openings that allowed specific celestial events to be observed and recorded, while acoustic properties were engineered to amplify the voices of priests during ritual performances. Stone benches along the walls provided seating for elite participants in ceremonies, while hidden chambers beneath the floor contained caches of ritual offerings, including jade ornaments, obsidian blades, and incense burners crafted specifically for temple use. The residential architecture of Toltecs reflected the increasingly complex social stratification that characterized Toltec society during this period. Elite compounds near the ceremonial center featured multi-room structures built around central courtyards, with walls constructed of carefully fitted stone blocks and finished with polished plaster surfaces. These houses included specialized rooms for different activities, including sleeping quarters, storage areas, workshops, and reception halls for entertaining guests and conducting business. The largest elite residences covered areas exceeding 1,000 square meters and housed extended families including servants, craftsmen, and other dependents. The interior decoration of elite residences demonstrated the sophisticated artistic traditions that flourished during this period of urban development. Wall paintings executed in mineral pigments depicted scenes from Toltec mythology, historical events, and religious ceremonies, while stone sculptures adorned courtyards and entrance areas. Floors were often covered with polished plaster and decorated with geometric patterns created using coloured stone inlays. The presence of specialised rooms for craft production within elite compounds indicates that wealthy families maintained their own workshops for producing luxury goods and ceremonial objects. Commoner residential architecture, while less elaborate than elite housing, still demonstrated significant improvements over earlier village-level construction. Most families lived in single-room structures measuring 6 meters on each side, built using stone foundations and adobe walls with thatched roofs. These houses were typically arranged around shared courtyards that served multiple families and included common facilities such as cooking areas, storage pits, and workshops. The standardization of house sizes and construction techniques suggests that urban planners had established building codes and regulations that governed residential construction throughout the city. The population growth that accompanied urban development at Toltecs created unprecedented demands for food production and distribution systems. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city's inhabitants consumed a diverse diet that included maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, and various wild plants gathered from surrounding areas. Protein sources included domesticated dogs and turkeys, as well as deer, rabbits, and other game animals hunted in nearby forests. The scale of food consumption required sophisticated storage and distribution networks that connected urban consumers with agricultural producers throughout the Tula River Valley and beyond. The development of specialized craft production during this period transformed Toltecs into a major manufacturing center that supplied goods throughout central Mexico. Archaeological excavations have revealed numerous workshop areas where craftsmen produced obsidian tools, ceramic vessels, textiles, and other goods for both local use and regional exchange. The organization of these workshops demonstrates increasing specialization and standardization with evidence suggesting that master craftsmen supervised teams of apprentices and journeymen in the production of specific types of objects. Obsidian tool production reached unprecedented levels of sophistication during this period, with Toltec craftsmen developing new techniques for creating specialized implements. Prismatic blade production achieved remarkable consistency, with blades showing standardized dimensions and edge angles that indicate quality control measures. The production of ceremonial objects from obsidian, including ornate knives and mirrors, required exceptional skill and demonstrated the high status accorded to master craftsmen. Workshop areas contained thousands of pieces of production debris, indicating that tool manufacturing operated on an industrial scale that supplied markets throughout Mesoamerica. Ceramic production during this period showed the full development of distinctive Toltec artistic styles that would influence pottery traditions throughout central Mexico. The Mazapan ceramic complex, which had emerged during the previous century, reached its full artistic maturity with vessels displaying sophisticated decorative techniques and standardized forms. Orange and red slip ceramics featured geometric designs executed with remarkable precision, while ritual vessels incorporated sculptural elements that reflected the iconographic themes visible in monumental architecture. The discovery of ceramic workshops with specialized firing facilities indicates that pottery production had become a highly organized industry that supplied both utilitarian and ceremonial needs. Textile production represented another major craft specialization that contributed to Tolan-Xicoquitlan's economic prosperity. Archaeological evidence includes numerous spindle whorls, loom weights, and other weaving implements that demonstrate the scale and sophistication of cloth manufacturing. The presence of cotton fibers and imported dyes indicates that Toltec weavers had access to raw materials from diverse ecological zones, while the standardization of textile tools suggest organized production systems. Elite burials from this period contained elaborate textiles decorated with feathered designs and geometric patterns that required exceptional skill to create. The emergence of metallurgy as a specialized craft during this period marked a significant technological advancement that gave Toltec artisans new capabilities for creating both utilitarian and ceremonial objects. Copperworking, which had appeared in limited form during the previous century, expanded to include the production of bells, needles, tweezers, and decorative elements. The technical knowledge required for smelting and casting copper objects indicates that Toltec craftsmen had established contact with metal-producing regions in western Mexico and had successfully adapted these technologies to local conditions. The political organization that emerged during this period of urban development reflected the increasing complexity of Toltec society and the need for centralized authority to coordinate large-scale construction projects and manage urban populations. Archaeological evidence suggests that political power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite group that controlled both religious and secular authority. The construction of elaborate elite residences near the ceremonial center indicates that rulers maintained close physical proximity to the temples and administrative buildings that served as centers of political power. The iconographic program that decorated public buildings and ceremonial spaces communicated complex messages about political authority and religious ideology that legitimized elite rule. Relief sculptures depicting warriors, priests, and deities established visual connections between earthly rulers and divine powers, while scenes of ritual sacrifice emphasized the ruler's role as intermediaries between human and supernatural realms. The standardization of iconographic motifs across different architectural contexts suggests that political authorities had developed sophisticated systems for controlling artistic production and ensuring consistent ideological messaging. Trade networks established during this period of urban development extended Toltec influence throughout Mesoamerica and brought exotic goods and raw materials to Tolan-Xicoquitlan. Archaeological evidence indicates that Toltec merchants maintained regular contact with regions as distant as the Maya lowlands, the Pacific coast of Guatemala, and the northern frontiers of Mexico. The presence of imported materials in both elite and commoner contexts suggests that trade networks supplied both luxury goods and everyday necessities, while the export of Toltec-produced items spread their cultural influence throughout central Mexico. The administrative systems that developed to manage this expanding trade network required sophisticated record-keeping and communication technologies. While no written documents survive from this period, archaeological evidence suggests that Toltec administrators used various systems for tracking goods, recording transactions, and communicating with distant trading partners. The standardization of weights and measures, evidenced by ceramic and stone objects with consistent proportions, indicates that trade was conducted according to established protocols that facilitated exchange across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The administrative systems and trade networks that had transformed Tollan-Xico-Cotitlan into a major urban centre by 980 AD provided the foundation for one of the most significant and controversial reigns in Mesoamerican history. It was during this period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural flowering that a figure emerged whose historical reality has become so intertwined with mythology that separating fact from legend remains one of the greatest challenges in Toltec studies. C.E. Acatl Quetzalcoatl, whose very name combines calendrical, political and religious elements, ruled Tollan during its golden age, while simultaneously becoming the central figure in a mythological cycle that would influence Mesoamerican religious thought for centuries. The historical C.E. Acatl appears in the archaeological record through a series of monumental inscriptions, architectural modifications, and material culture changes that mark his reign as a period of intensive religious and political transformation. His calendar name, C.E. Acatl, corresponds to the year 895 or 947 AD in the Christian calendar, though most scholars favour the later date based on architectural evidence from Tula. The title Topiltzin, meaning our prince or our lord, indicates his political authority, while his association with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity, reflects either his priestly role or his posthumous deification. Contemporary inscriptions from Tula show that during his lifetime, he was referred to primarily by his calendar name and political title, with the divine associations appearing more prominently in later sources. Archaeological evidence from Pyramid B and the Temple of Tlahuizcalpantecutli reveal substantial architectural modifications undertaken during Topiltzin's reign that reflect significant changes in religious practice and ceremonial protocols. New construction phases dating to this period show the addition of specialized chambers and altars designed for rituals associated with Quetzalcoatl worship, while earlier spaces dedicated to other deities were either modified or abandoned entirely. Stone sculptures commissioned during this time emphasize feathered serpent imagery and Venus symbolism, marking a clear departure from the jaguar and eagle motifs that had dominated earlier Toltec art. The most dramatic evidence for religious transformation during Topiltzin's reign comes from changes in sacrificial practices documented through archaeological remains and later historical accounts. Excavations at ceremonial sites throughout Tula reveal a marked decrease in evidence for human sacrifice during the late 10th century, with traditional offering caches containing fewer human remains and more emphasis on precious materials like jade, obsidian, and copal incense. This shift corresponds with ethno-historical accounts describing Topiltzin's religious reforms, which allegedly emphasize bloodless offerings of flowers, butterflies, and precious stones rather than human hearts and blood. The promotion of Quetzalcoatl worship over traditional Toltec deities represented a fundamental challenge to established religious hierarchies and the warrior culture that had dominated Toltec society since its emergence. Quetzalcoatl, as a deity associated with wind, learning, and the planet Venus, embodied very different values from Tezcatlipoca, the traditional patron of Toltec warriors, who represented conflict, night, and terrestrial power. Archaeological evidence suggests that temples dedicated to Tezcatlipoca received reduced maintenance and fewer offerings during this period, while new shrines to Quetzalcoatl were constructed throughout the urban centre. The religious reforms initiated by Topiltzin extended beyond ceremonial practices to encompass fundamental changes in the organisation of the priesthood and the conduct of religious education. New types of ritual objects appearing in archaeological contexts during this period include elaborate incense burners designed for copal offerings, carved bone instruments for bloodless auto-sacrifice, and ceramic vessels decorated with symbols associated with learning and writing. The construction of specialised schools or kamikak within the ceremonial precinct provided facilities for training priests in the new religious traditions, with architectural features designed to facilitate astronomical observations and the study of calendrical systems. The emphasis on learning and intellectual pursuits that characterized Topiltzin's religious reforms had profound implications for Toltec material culture and artistic production. Scribal tools, including obsidian styluses and bark paper, appear more frequently in elite contexts during this period, suggesting increased emphasis on record-keeping and the preservation of religious knowledge. Ceramic vessels and stone sculptures from this time display more complex iconographic programs that required specialized knowledge to interpret, indicating the development of sophisticated symbolic systems accessible only to trained priests and educated elites. The political implications of these religious changes created tensions within Toltec society that would ultimately lead to Topiltzin's downfall. The warrior nobility, whose power and prestige depended on traditional military values and the ritual capture of enemies for sacrifice, found their authority challenged by a religious system that emphasized peace, learning, and bloodless offerings. Archaeological evidence from elite residential compounds shows changes in weapon caches and warrior regalia during this period, with some households apparently adapting to the new religious emphasis, while others maintain traditional military equipment and symbols. The factional struggles that emerged during Topiltzin's reign are documented through changes in architectural patronage and the distribution of luxury goods within Tolan-Zika-Kutitlan. Elite compounds associated with traditional warrior families show evidence of reduced construction activity and fewer imported goods during the late 10th century, while residences of families aligned with the new religious order display increased wealth and architectural elaboration. This economic redistribution created resentment among displaced traditional elites and provided the foundation for organized opposition to Topiltzin's rule. The role of Tezcatlipoca priests in organizing opposition to Topiltzin's reforms is suggested by archaeological evidence from temples dedicated to this deity, which show signs of deliberate destruction and abandonment during the late 10th century, followed by hasty restoration efforts that suggest political upheaval. Offering caches from this period contain unusual combinations of objects that may represent attempts to revive traditional religious practices in opposition to the imposed Quetzalcoatl cult. The presence of warrior symbols and traditional sacrificial implements in these contexts indicates that military factions maintained their religious allegiances despite official policy changes. The climax of these factional struggles appears to have occurred around 987 AD, based on evidence of widespread destruction and abandonment at several important sites throughout the Tula region. Archaeological layers dating to this period contain burned buildings, scattered human remains, and evidence of hasty burial of valuable objects, suggesting violent conflict that disrupted normal urban life. The specific nature of this destruction, which targeted religious buildings associated with Quetzalcoatl worship while leaving traditional temples relatively undamaged, indicates that the conflict had strong religious and ideological dimensions. Contemporary accounts preserved in later Nahuatl sources describe the events leading to Topiltzin's exile in terms that that blend historical fact with mythological narrative. According to these sources, Tezcatlipoca priests used sorcery and political manipulation to discredit Topiltzin, eventually forcing him to abandon Tolan and flee toward the eastern coast. While the supernatural elements of these accounts clearly represent later mythological elaboration, the core narrative of political conflict and forced exile corresponds with archaeological evidence for disruption and abandonment at Tula during the late 10th century. The archaeological evidence for Topiltzin's departure from Tolan includes the abandonment of several important religious buildings and the hasty burial of ceremonial objects associated with Quetzalcoatl worship. Excavations at the temple of Tlaxcalpantecutli have revealed caches of ritual implements buried beneath floor levels dating to this period, suggesting that priests loyal to Topiltzin attempted to preserve sacred objects before abandoning the site. Similar deposits found at other locations throughout the ceremonial precinct indicate a coordinated effort to protect religious materials from destruction by opposing factions. The direction of Topiltzin's exile, consistently described in later sources as toward the east and the Gulf Coast, corresponds with archaeological evidence for the sudden appearance of Toltec-style material culture in regions of Veracruz and Tabasco during the late 10th century. Sites such as Cacaxtla and Xochicalco show evidence of new construction phases and artistic programs that incorporate distinctively Toltec iconographic elements, particularly those associated with Quetzalcoatl worship. The timing and geographic distribution of these cultural influences suggests that Topiltzin and his followers established new centers of power in regions beyond the reach of their Tolan opponents. The most intriguing archaeological evidence for Topiltzin's post-exile activities comes from the Maya site of Chichen Itza in the northern Yucatan, where architectural and artistic elements show striking similarities to those from Tula. The Temple of Kukulkan, the Great Bull Court, and the Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza all display iconographic programs and architectural features that closely parallel structures built during Topiltzin's reign at Tolan. While the exact nature of the connection between these sites remains debated, the chronological correspondence and stylistic similarities suggest some form of direct cultural transmission that may be related to Topiltzin's exile and the movement of his followers. The religious innovations introduced during Topiltzin's reign had lasting impacts on Mesoamerican religious thought that extended far beyond the political upheavals that ended his rule at Tolan. The emphasis on Quetzalcoatl as a greater deity and culture hero became central to later Aztec religious traditions, while the concept of a priest-king who combined political and religious authority influenced political ideologies throughout central Mexico. Archaeological evidence from post-classic sites throughout Mesoamerica shows the continued use of religious symbols and ceremonial practices first developed during Topiltzin's reign, indicating the enduring influence of his religious reforms. The transformation of the historical Topiltzin into the mythological Quetzalcoatl began almost immediately after his departure from Tolan, as evidenced by changes in artistic representations and ceremonial practices at Tula itself. Stone sculptures and ceramic vessels produced in the decades following his exile show increasingly idealized depictions of the ruler, with human features gradually giving way to divine attributes associated with the feathered serpent deity. This process of deification was facilitated by the religious reforms that Topiltzin had implemented, which had already established close associations between his political authority and divine power. The mythological cycle that developed around Topiltzin's life and reign incorporated elements from much older Mesoamerican religious traditions, while adding new themes that reflected the specific historical circumstances of his rule. The story of his miraculous birth, his role as a culture hero who brought learning and civilization to humanity, and his eventual departure with promises of return all drew upon ancient mythological patterns while incorporating details that corresponded to actual historical events. This blending of history and mythology created a powerful narrative framework that would influence Mesoamerican religious thought for centuries. The archaeological record from Toltecs in the immediate aftermath of Topiltzin's exile shows evidence of attempts to restore traditional religious practices and political structures. Temples dedicated to Tezcatlipoca were rebuilt and rededicated, while new construction projects emphasize military themes and warrior symbolism. However, the religious and cultural changes initiated during Topiltzin's reign had created lasting transformations in Toltec society that could not be entirely reversed. Many of the artistic and architectural innovations developed during his rule continue to influence Toltec culture, while the religious ideas associated with his reforms spread to other regions through trade networks and political alliances. The legacy of C.E. Acatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl extended beyond the immediate political and religious sphere to encompass fundamental changes in Mesoamerican concepts of rulership, divine authority, and the relationship between political power and religious knowledge. His reign established precedents for the integration of priestly and royal functions that would influence later political systems throughout central Mexico, while his religious reforms introduced new forms of ceremonial practice and symbolic expression that enrich Mesoamerican cultural traditions. The archaeological evidence for these innovations provides concrete documentation for the historical reality behind the mythological narratives, demonstrating that the legendary Quetzalcoatl was indeed based on the achievements and failures of a remarkable historical figure whose brief but transformative reign fundamentally altered the trajectory of Toltec civilization. The political upheavals that mark the end of Topiltzin's reign and the restoration of traditional warrior leadership at Toltecs created the conditions for the most aggressive phase of Toltec territorial expansion in their history. The faction that emerged victorious from the factional struggles of the late 10th century represented a coalition of military nobles, Tezcatlipoca priests, and merchant families who shared a vision of Toltec dominance based on military conquest rather than religious reform. Archaeological evidence from the early 11th century reveals a dramatic shift in resource allocation towards military infrastructure, weapon production, and the construction of fortified outposts throughout central Mexico that would serve as bases for systematic territorial expansion. The military innovations that enabled Toltec expansion built upon centuries of Mesoamerican warfare traditions, while introducing technological and organizational improvements that gave Toltec armies decisive advantages over their opponents. The most significant of these innovations was the systematic adoption and refinement of the atlatl, a spear-throwing device that had been used sporadically throughout Mesoamerica, but reached unprecedented levels of effectiveness under Toltec military engineers. Archaeological specimens recovered from weapon caches at Tula show that Toltec atlatls were constructed using carefully selected hardwoods, often reinforced with bone or antler components and decorated with carved designs that indicated the rank and unit affiliation of their users. The effectiveness of Toltec atlatls derived not only from superior construction materials and techniques, but also from innovations in projectile design that maximized range and penetrating power. Dart points recovered from military contexts show standardized dimensions and aerodynamic profiles that indicate systematic experimentation with different designs to optimize performance. The most effective Toltec dart points featured long, narrow blades with carefully crafted tangs that ensured secure hafting to wooden shafts. These projectiles, when launched by skilled atlatl users, could penetrate enemy armor at distances exceeding 100 meters, giving Toltec forces significant tactical advantages in open terrain combat. Training in atlatl use became a central component of Toltec military education, with archaeological evidence from Tula revealing specialized practice ranges where warriors honed their skills. These facilities included earthen backstops marked with concentric circles that allowed instructors to evaluate accuracy at various distances, while collections of practice points made from less valuable materials than combat weapons suggest that training was conducted on a large scale. Skeletal remains from Toltec warrior burials show distinctive muscle development patterns in the right shoulder and arm that correspond to intensive atlatl training, providing physical evidence for the rigorous military conditioning that produced elite Toltec fighters. The production and distribution of obsidian weaponry during this period reached unprecedented scales that transformed both military capabilities and economic organisation throughout the Toltec sphere of influence. Obsidian workshops at Tula expanded dramatically during the early 11th century, with excavations revealing production areas covering several hectares and containing millions of pieces of knapping debris. The organisation of these workshops shows clear evidence of mass production techniques, with specialised craftsmen focusing on particular stages of the manufacturing process to maximise efficiency and maintain quality control. Toltec military engineers developed new techniques for hafting obsidian blades to wooden weapons that created devastatingly effective close combat implements. Makuahitl, the wooden clubs embedded with obsidian blades that would later become iconic Aztec weapons, appear to have been perfected during this period of Toltec military innovation. Archaeological specimens show sophisticated understanding of stress distribution and blade placement that created weapons capable of inflicting terrible wounds while maintaining structural integrity during extended combat. The razor-sharp obsidian edges could sever limbs and penetrate most forms of Mesoamerican armour, making Toltec warriors formidable opponents in hand-to-hand fighting. The standardization of obsidian weapon production allowed Toltec military commanders to equip large armies with uniform weapons that simplified logistics and training requirements. Blade caches found at military installations throughout the Toltec sphere contained thousands of identical projectile points and knife blades, indicating centralized production and distribution systems that could supply weapons to forces operating hundreds of kilometers from Tula. This logistical capability gave Toltec armies significant advantages over opponents who relied on locally produced weapons of varying quality and design. The organizational structure of Toltec military forces during this period of expansion incorporated the famous eagle and jaguar warrior societies that would later become central to Aztec military tradition. Archaeological evidence from Tula includes specialized residential compounds associated with these military orders, featuring distinctive architectural elements and decorative programs that reflected their martial functions. Eagle warrior quarters were decorated with carved stone panels depicting eagles in flight and warriors wearing feathered costumes, while jaguar warrior compounds featured sculptures of prowling jaguars and warriors dressed in spotted jaguar skins. The eagle warriors specialized in long-range combat using atlatls and arrows, with their training emphasizing accuracy, mobility, and reconnaissance skills that made them ideal for scouting and skirmishing operations. Archaeological evidence from their quarters includes specialized storage facilities for arrows and atlatl darts, practice targets designed for aerial combat simulation, and workshop areas where warriors maintained their equipment. Burials of eagle warriors contain elaborate feathered costumes and weapons decorated with bird motifs, while skeletal analysis reveals physical conditioning consistent with extensive training in running and climbing. Jaguar warriors focused on close-quarters combat, using obsidian-edged weapons and specialized tactics designed for urban warfare and siege operations. Their quarters at Tula contained training facilities equipped with wooden posts and straw targets for practicing sword and club techniques, while underground chambers served as storage areas for the heavy armor and weapons required for assault operations. Jaguar warrior burials include massive obsidian clubs, thick cotton armor, and helmets carved to resemble jaguar heads, emphasizing their role as shock troops in Toltec military operations. The initiation rituals and training programs that prepared young Toltec nobles for membership in these warrior societies are documented through archaeological evidence from ceremonial areas within their residential compounds. Specialized chambers contained altars where initiates underwent ritual scarification and bloodletting ceremonies that mark their transition from civilian to military status. The presence of elaborate incense burners, obsidian bloodletting implements, and offering caches containing military equipment suggests that these initiation rites involved complex religious ceremonies that bound warriors to their military orders through sacred oaths and divine protection. The territorial expansion that began in earnest around 1000 AD followed a systematic pattern that reveals sophisticated strategic planning and coordination among Toltec military commanders. Rather than random raiding or opportunistic conquest, Toltec expansion proceeded according to a deliberate plan that prioritized control of key trade routes, agricultural regions, and strategic defensive positions. Archaeological evidence from newly conquered territories shows the rapid establishment of Toltec administrative centers, military garrisons, and tribute collection facilities that indicate well-developed systems for integrating conquered populations into the Toltec sphere of influence. The first phase of expansion focused on consolidating Toltec control over the basin of Mexico and adjacent valleys that provided agricultural resources and defensive depth for the capital at Tula. Military campaigns during this period targeted independent city-states and village confederations that had maintained autonomy since the collapse of Teotihuacan, using combinations of military pressure and diplomatic incentives to bring them under Toltec authority. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Azcapotzalco, Culhuacan, and Xochimilco shows the construction of Toltec-style administrative buildings and the adoption of Toltec material culture during the early 11th century, indicating successful integration of these communities into the expanding Toltec state. The military campaigns that brought these regions under Toltec control involved coordinated operations by multiple army groups that converged on target settlements from different directions. Fortified camps established during these campaigns show evidence of sophisticated logistical planning, with storage facilities for food and weapons, workshops for maintaining equipment, and communication systems that allowed commanders to coordinate movements across large distances. The speed and efficiency of these conquests suggest that Toltec military leaders had developed effective intelligence networks that provided detailed information about enemy capabilities and defensive preparations. The establishment of tribute relationships with conquered territories created the economic foundation for continued military expansion, while providing incentives for local elites to cooperate with Toltec administrators. Archaeological evidence from tribute collection centers shows the systematic gathering and redistribution of agricultural products, craft goods, and raw materials from throughout the Toltec sphere of influence. Standardized storage facilities, accounting systems using marked pottery vessels and knotted cord records, and specialized transportation networks indicate that tribute collection had become a highly organized operation that generated substantial revenues for the Toltec state. The tribute system established by Toltec administrators required conquered populations to provide specific quantities of goods on regular schedules, with failure to meet obligations resulting in military intervention and increased tribute burdens. Lists of tribute obligations preserved in later colonial documents suggest that the Toltec system served as a model for later Aztec practices, with communities required to provide combinations of agricultural products, manufactured goods, and raw materials based on their local resources and productive capabilities. Archaeological evidence from tribute-paying communities shows the construction of specialized storage and processing facilities designed to meet these obligations, indicating that tribute collection had significant impacts on local economic organization. The development of long-distance trade networks during this period of military expansion created commercial connections that extended from the northern frontiers of Mexico to the Maya regions of Central America. Toltec merchants, operating under military protection and official state sponsorship, established trading posts and commercial relationships that brought exotic goods and raw materials to Tollan-Xicocoatitlan, while spreading Toltec cultural influence throughout Mesoamerica. Archaeological evidence for these trade networks includes the widespread distribution of Toltec-produced goods and the presence of foreign materials in Toltec contexts that demonstrate the scale and sophistication of these commercial operations. The northern trade routes established during this period connected Toltec territories with the turquoise mines of the American Southwest and the emerging Pueblo cultures of the Rio Grande Valley. Archaeological evidence from sites in northern Mexico shows the presence of Toltec traders and the adoption of Toltec artistic styles and religious practices by local populations. Turquoise ornaments found in elite burials at Tula demonstrate the success of these northern trade connections, while the presence of southwestern pottery and other exotic goods indicates that commercial relationships were reciprocal and mutually beneficial. The southern trade networks extended Toltec influence into the Maya regions of Guatemala and the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, bringing Toltec merchants into contact with some of the most sophisticated civilizations in Mesoamerica. The archaeological evidence from Maya sites during this period shows significant Toltec influence in architecture, art and religious practices, particularly at Chichen Itza, where Toltec-style buildings and sculptures appear alongside traditional Maya constructions. The presence of Maya jade, cacao and feathered ornaments in Toltec contexts indicates that these trade relationships provided access to luxury goods that enhanced the prestige and wealth of Toltec elites. The organization of these long-distance trade expeditions required sophisticated logistical planning and military support that demonstrates the close integration of commercial and military activities in Toltec expansion strategy. Merchant caravans traveling to distant regions carried armed guards equipped with the latest Toltec weapons and armor, while established trade routes included fortified way stations where merchants could rest and resupply during long journeys. The standardization of weights and measures throughout the Toltec sphere of influence facilitated commercial transactions, while diplomatic protocols ensured that Toltec merchants received favorable treatment in foreign territories. The political alliances and conflicts that characterized Toltec expansion brought them into direct contact with other major Mesoamerican civilizations, creating complex diplomatic relationships that combined cooperation and competition. The most significant of these relationships was with the various Maya city-states of the Yucatan Peninsula, where Toltec influence appears to have been welcomed by some rulers while being resisted by others. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Chichen Itza suggests that Toltec warriors and administrators may have established direct political control over some Maya territories, while other regions maintained independence through military resistance or diplomatic accommodation. The interactions between Toltec and Maya civilizations during this period produced remarkable cultural syntheses that enriched both traditions while creating new forms of artistic and architectural expression. The famous ball court at Chichen Itza, with its distinctive Toltec-style relief sculptures depicting ritual sacrifice and warrior imagery, represents one of the most spectacular examples of this cultural fusion. The presence of Maya astronomical knowledge in Toltec ceremonial buildings at Tula, combined with Toltec military symbolism in Maya art, indicates that cultural exchange operated in both directions and involved high-level cooperation between elite groups from both civilizations. The conflicts that arose between Toltec expansion and Maya resistance created some of the most intense warfare of the Classic period, with archaeological evidence revealing fortified cities, burned settlements, and mass burials that document the violence of these confrontations. Maya defensive innovations, including improved fortifications and new weapon designs, forced Toltec military commanders to adapt their tactics and develop new strategies for siege warfare. The presence of Maya weapons and armor in Toltec military contexts suggests that successful campaigns involved the adoption of enemy technologies and techniques that proved effective against Toltec forces. The relationship between Toltec expansion and the Huastec peoples of the Gulf Coast created another complex pattern of alliance and conflict that shaped the political landscape of eastern Mexico. The Huastec, with their distinctive cultural traditions and strategic control of important trade routes, represented both valuable allies and formidable opponents for Toltec expansion efforts. Archaeological evidence from Huastec sites shows periods of Toltec influence alternating with episodes of cultural resistance, suggesting that political relationships fluctuated based on changing military and economic circumstances. The Huastec adoption of certain Toltec military technologies, particularly improved obsidian weapons and atlatl designs, indicates that cultural exchange occurred even during periods of political conflict. Huastec artistic traditions during this period show the incorporation of Toltec motifs and symbolic systems, while maintaining distinctive local characteristics that reflected their independent cultural identity. The presence of Huastec goods in Toltec contexts, including distinctive pottery styles and marine shell ornaments, demonstrates that commercial relationships continued despite periodic military confrontations. The military campaigns against Huastec territories required Toltec forces to adapt to unfamiliar environmental conditions and tactical situations that differed significantly from highland warfare. The dense forests and swampy terrain of the Gulf Coast region negated many of the advantages provided by Toltec atlatl technology, while Huastec guerrilla tactics and knowledge of local geography created significant challenges for Toltec military commanders. Archaeological evidence from Toltec military sites in Huastec territory shows the development of new types of fortifications and the adoption of specialized equipment designed for jungle warfare. The establishment of Toltec political hegemony throughout central Mexico by the mid-11th century represented one of the most remarkable achievements in Mesoamerican political history, creating a unified state system that controlled territory from the northern deserts to the tropical lowlands of the south. This political integration was maintained through a combination of military force, economic incentives, and cultural influence that bound diverse populations together under Toltec leadership, while allowing considerable local autonomy in matters that did not threaten state interests. The archaeological evidence for this political system reveals sophisticated administrative structures, communication networks, and tribute collection mechanisms that enabled effective governance over vast territories and diverse populations. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that enabled Toltec political control across central Mexico operated within a complex religious framework that legitimized secular authority while providing the cosmological foundations for imperial expansion. The Toltec pantheon that emerged during the height of their power represented a synthesis of diverse Mesoamerican religious traditions, incorporating deities and ceremonial practices from conquered territories while maintaining distinctive theological innovations that reflected their unique historical experience. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial centers throughout the Toltec sphere reveals the systematic development of religious institutions that served both spiritual and political functions, creating an integrated system of belief and practice that bound together the diverse populations of their empire. The supreme deity of the mature Toltec religious system was Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, whose worship had been transformed from the localized cult promoted by C.E. Acatltopiltzin into a universal creator god whose authority extended throughout the known world. Sculptural representations from the 11th century show Quetzalcoatl as a composite being combining the terrestrial power of the serpent with the celestial authority of the bird, often depicted with elaborate feathered crests, serpentine bodies covered in precious stones, and symbolic elements connecting him to wind, rain, and agricultural fertility. The iconographic program developed for Quetzalcoatl worship emphasized his role as the divine patron of learning, craftsmanship, and civilized society, making him an ideal deity for legitimizing Toltec claims to cultural and political superiority over their subjects. Temple complexes dedicated to Quetzalcoatl throughout Toltec territory shared distinctive architectural features that facilitated specific forms of worship while creating visual connections to the ceremonial center at Tollan-Sicocotitlan. These structures typically featured circular or semicircular ground plans that reflected the deity's association with wind and cyclical time, while their facades were decorated with carved, feathered serpent motifs executed in local stone but following standardized proportions and symbolic arrangements. The interior spaces of these temples contained specialized altars designed for the presentation of bloodless offerings, including flowers, copal incense, precious stones, and elaborately crafted objects that demonstrated the wealth and devotion of worshippers. The theological significance of Quetzalcoatl worship extended beyond ceremonial observance to encompass fundamental concepts about the nature of divine authority and its relationship to earthly rule. Toltec religious texts, preserved in later colonial sources but clearly drawing upon much older traditions, describe Quetzalcoatl as the creator of human beings and the inventor of agriculture, writing, and the calendar system that governed religious and secular life. This mythological framework provided Toltec rulers with divine sanction for their political authority, while establishing their responsibility for maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual observance and moral behavior. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, occupied a complex position within the Toltec pantheon that reflected both his traditional role as patron of warriors and his association with the political upheavals that had shaped Toltec history. Archaeological evidence from military contexts shows continued reverence for Tezcatlipoca among warrior societies, with obsidian mirrors, jaguar imagery, and symbols of night and conflict appearing frequently in martial burials and ceremonial deposits. However, the theological relationship between Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl was reconceptualized during the imperial period to emphasize complementarity rather than opposition, with the two deities representing necessary aspects of cosmic balance, rather than irreconcilable antagonists. Sculptural programs from major Toltec sites depict Tezcatlipoca as a powerful deity whose authority encompassed warfare, judgment, and the maintenance of social order through the application of divine justice. His iconographic attributes included obsidian mirrors that revealed hidden truths, jaguar associations that emphasized his predatory power, and missing foot that connected him to sacrifice and the voluntary surrender of personal well-being for cosmic stability. Priests dedicated to Tezcatlipoca worship maintained specialized knowledge of divination techniques, judicial procedures, and military rituals that made them essential participants in both religious ceremonies and secular administration. The integration of Tezcatlipoca worship into the broader Toltec religious system required careful theological maneuvering that acknowledged his traditional importance, while subordinating his cult to the supreme authority of Quetzalcoatl. Temple complexes throughout Toltec territory typically included shrines dedicated to both deities, with architectural arrangements that emphasized their complementary functions while maintaining clear hierarchical relationships. Ceremonial calendars coordinated festivals honoring both gods in sequences that reinforced theological messages about cosmic balance and the necessity of both creative and destructive forces in maintaining universal order. Tlaloc, the ancient rain god whose worship extended back to the earliest periods of Mesoamerican civilization, occupied a crucial position within Toltec religious practice, due to his direct connection to agricultural productivity and economic prosperity. The expansion of Toltec political control into diverse ecological zones required sophisticated understanding of local rainfall patterns, seasonal variations, and agricultural techniques that made Tlaloc worship essential for maintaining food production throughout the empire. Archaeological evidence from Tlaloc temples shows the development of elaborate water management systems, including channels, reservoirs, and drainage networks that served both ceremonial and practical functions. The iconographic representation of Tlaloc in Toltec art emphasized his control over life-giving rain, while acknowledging his potentially destructive power through floods, storms, and agricultural disasters. Sculptural depictions typically showed him with distinctive goggle eyes, fanged mouth, and elaborate headdresses incorporating cloud and lightning motifs executed in materials that emphasized his connection to water and fertility. Ceramic vessels used in Tlaloc ceremonies featured distinctive blue-green glazes that evoked water and jade, while their forms often incorporated serpentine elements that connected rain worship to broader theological themes about cosmic serpents and celestial waters. The ceremonial practices associated with Tlaloc worship involved complex rituals designed to ensure adequate rainfall while preventing destructive storms that could damage crops and settlements. These ceremonies required specialized knowledge of astronomical observations, meteorological patterns, and agricultural cycles that made Tlaloc priests essential advisors to both farmers and political administrators. Offering practices included the presentation of jade ornaments, turquoise mosaics, and precious stones thrown into sacred cenotes and natural springs, while more elaborate ceremonies involved the construction of temporary altars decorated with flowers, feathers, and textiles in colours associated with rain and vegetation. The theological relationship between Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl was conceptualized through shared associations with fertility, agricultural abundance, and the maintenance of civilized society. Religious texts describe collaborative relationships between these deities in creating and sustaining human life, with Quetzalcoatl providing the cultural knowledge necessary for civilization, while Tlaloc supplied the natural resources required for survival and prosperity. This theological framework supported Toltec political claims to legitimate authority based on their ability to maintain both cultural advancement and material well-being for their subjects. Xochiquetzal, the goddess of love, beauty, and domestic crafts, represented the feminine aspects of Toltec religious thought while providing divine patronage for activities that were central to household economy and social reproduction. Her worship was particularly important among women engaged in textile production, food preparation, and child-rearing, activities that were essential for maintaining the social fabric of Toltec communities but often received less attention in male-dominated religious institutions. Archaeological evidence from domestic contexts shows widespread devotion to Xochiquetzal through small-scale sculptures, ceramic figurines, and household altars decorated with flowers and feminine symbols. The iconographic program developed for Xochiquetzal worship emphasized her connection to flowering plants, butterflies, and precious textiles that represented both natural beauty and human artistic achievement. Sculptural representations typically depicted her as a young woman wearing elaborate costumes, decorated with floral motifs, accompanied by butterflies and birds that symbolize the transformation of natural materials into objects of beauty and utility. Temple complexes dedicated to her worship featured gardens, where flowers and medicinal plants were cultivated for ceremonial use, while specialized workshops produced textiles and other craft goods that served both religious and economic functions. The ceremonial calendar that governed Toltec religious observance represented one of the most sophisticated achievements of Mesoamerican intellectual culture, integrating astronomical observations with agricultural cycles and political events in a comprehensive system that provided temporal structure for all aspects of social life. This calendar system combined a 260-day ritual cycle with a 365-day solar year to create a complex pattern of recurring festivals, ceremonies, and observances that required specialized knowledge to calculate and maintain. Priests responsible for calendar keeping maintained detailed records using various notation systems that allowed them to predict eclipses, planetary movements, and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. The ritual cycle of 260 days, known as the Tonal Pohuali, consisted of 20 day signs combined with 13 numbers to create a repeating pattern that provided the framework for divination, ritual scheduling, and personal naming practices. Each day within this cycle was associated with specific deities, favourable or unfavourable influences, and appropriate activities that guided both individual behaviour and community decision-making. Archaeological evidence from Toltec sites includes numerous examples of calendrical notation systems, including carved stone monuments, ceramic vessels marked with day signs, and architectural alignments that corresponded to significant dates within the ritual calendar. The solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 18 months of 20 days each plus 5 additional days, provided the structure for agricultural planning and seasonal ceremonies that connected human activities to natural cycles. Each month was dedicated to specific deities and associated with particular types of ritual observance, from planting and harvest ceremonies to military campaigns and tribute collection. The 5 extra days at the end of each solar year were considered particularly dangerous and required special ceremonies to ensure safe passage into the new annual cycle. Human sacrifice occupied a central but carefully regulated position within Toltec religious practice, serving multiple functions that included communication with deities, maintenance of cosmic balance, and demonstration of a political power. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial centres shows that Toltec sacrifice practices were more restrained than those of later Mesoamerican civilizations, with emphasis placed on the quality and symbolic significance of offerings rather than sheer quantity of victims. Specialized altars designed for sacrificial ceremonies featured elaborate drainage systems and decorative programs that emphasized the sacred nature of these rituals while providing practical facilities for their performance. The selection of sacrifice victims followed strict protocols that emphasized their ritual purity and symbolic appropriateness for specific ceremonies. Warriors captured in battle represented the most prestigious offerings, particularly those taken from enemy elite units whose sacrifice demonstrated Toltec military superiority while providing powerful spiritual benefits. Archaeological evidence suggests that many sacrificial victims were maintained in special facilities for extended periods before their deaths, receiving elaborate care and ritual preparation that enhanced their sacred status and ensured the effectiveness of their sacrifice. The methods employed for human sacrifice varied according to the specific deities being honoured and the ceremonial context of the ritual. Heart extraction, performed using specialized obsidian knives with elaborately carved handles, was reserved for the most important ceremonies and typically involved victims who had undergone extensive ritual preparation. Drowning sacrifices honoured Tlaloc and other water deities, while burning was employed for ceremonies dedicated to solar and fire gods. The remains of sacrificial victims were treated with great reverence, often receiving elaborate burial or being incorporated into sacred structures as foundation offerings. The astronomical observations that underpin Toltec religious and political activities represented some of the most sophisticated scientific achievements of ancient America, requiring generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation to develop accurate predictive systems. Toltec priest astronomers maintained detailed records of celestial events, using various notation systems that allowed them to predict eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and seasonal changes with remarkable precision. These observations were integrated into architectural planning, ceremonial scheduling, and agricultural decision-making in ways that demonstrated the practical applications of astronomical knowledge. The planet Venus received particular attention from Toltec astronomers due to its association with Quetzalcoatl in his aspect as Tlahuizcalpantecutli, the Lord of the Dawn. Detailed observations of Venus cycles allowed priests to predict its appearances as both morning and evening star, information that was crucial for timing important ceremonies and military campaigns. Archaeological evidence from Toltec sites includes numerous architectural alignments that correspond to Venus positions, while carved stone monuments record specific dates when Venus events coincided with significant political or religious occasions. Solar observations provided the foundation for agricultural planning and ceremonial scheduling throughout the Toltec sphere of influence. Priest astronomers maintained careful records of solstices, equinoxes, and seasonal changes that allowed them to coordinate planting and harvest activities across diverse ecological zones. Temple complexes throughout Toltec territory included specialized observation platforms and architectural alignments that facilitated accurate solar observations while providing dramatic settings for ceremonies timed to coincide with astronomical events. Lunar cycles were integrated into Toltec religious practice through ceremonies that honored lunar deities and utilized the moon's phases for timing specific types of ritual activity. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain sacrificial ceremonies were scheduled to coincide with lunar eclipses, while agricultural activities were often timed according to lunar phases that were believed to influence plant growth and animal behavior. The integration of lunar observations with solar and Venus cycles created a comprehensive astronomical system that provided temporal structure for all aspects of Toltec religious and secular life. The concept of Tollen as a sacred space extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the city to encompass a comprehensive vision of ideal, urban organization that influenced city planning throughout Mesoamerica for centuries after the collapse of Toltec political power. Archaeological evidence from Tollen-Zicocutitlan reveals sophisticated understanding of sacred geography, with the city's layout reflecting cosmological principles that connected earthly architecture to celestial patterns and divine authority. This sacred urban model was replicated at Toltec administrative centers throughout their territory, creating a network of ceremonial cities that reinforced political and religious unity across diverse populations and geographical regions. The central ceremonial precinct at Tollen-Zicocutitlan was designed as a microcosm of the universe, with architectural arrangements that corresponded to cardinal directions, celestial movements, and mythological narratives about divine creation and cosmic order. The Great Temple complex occupied the position of the cosmic center, with surrounding structures arranged to represent the four directions of the universe and their associated deities, colors, and symbolic meanings. Causeways connecting different areas of the ceremonial center followed alignments that corresponded to important astronomical events, while the spacing and proportions of buildings reflected mathematical relationships that encoded religious and philosophical concepts. The integration of residential areas into the sacred urban plan created a comprehensive environment where daily life was constantly connected to religious and cosmological themes. Elite residential compounds near the ceremonial center featured architectural elements that reflected their inhabitants' religious and political roles, while commoner housing areas were organized according to principles that maintained appropriate relationships to sacred spaces and ritual activities. The distribution of craft workshops, markets, and administrative buildings followed patterns that reinforced social hierarchy, while ensuring that all inhabitants could participate appropriately in community religious observances. The influence of Tollen's sacred urban model extended throughout Mesoamerica through the establishment of subsidiary ceremonial centers that replicated key features of the capital's design, while adapting to local geographical and cultural conditions. Archaeological evidence from Toltec-influenced sites shows the systematic application of urban planning principles that created visual and symbolic connections to Tollen while serving local political and religious needs. These ceremonial centers served as regional capitals that extended Toltec authority, while providing models for urban organization that influenced city planning practices long after the collapse of Toltec political power. The sacred urban planning principles that governed Tollen-Zicocutitlan's development created the physical framework within which Toltec artistic traditions reached unprecedented levels of sophistication and technical mastery. The workshops, ceremonial spaces, and elite residences constructed during the height of Toltec power provided both the infrastructure and patronage necessary for the emergence of distinctive artistic styles that synthesized diverse Mesoamerican traditions, while introducing innovations that would influence regional art production for centuries. Archaeological excavations throughout the Toltec sphere have revealed evidence of highly organized craft production systems that operated on scales previously unknown in central Mexico, creating standardized artistic products while maintaining the technical excellence and symbolic complexity that characterized elite Mesoamerican material culture. The sculptural traditions that emerged during the mature Toltec period represented a fundamental departure from earlier Mesoamerican artistic conventions, emphasizing geometric precision and symbolic clarity over the more naturalistic approaches that had characterized Teotihuacan and Maya art. Toltec sculptors developed distinctive techniques for working with the local limestone and basalt available around Tula, creating monuments that combined architectural functionality with complex iconographic programs. The famous Atlantean columns that supported the roof of Temple B demonstrate the technical mastery achieved by Toltec stone carvers, who transformed massive blocks of basalt into precisely proportioned warrior figures that served both structural and symbolic functions. These monumental sculptures required sophisticated understanding of both artistic composition and engineering principles, as each column needed to support substantial architectural loads while maintaining its sculptural integrity. The carving process began with the selection of appropriate stone blocks, which were quarried from specific geological formations that provided the necessary strength and workability. Master sculptors used bronze tools, stone hammers, and abrasive materials to shape the rough blocks into finished forms, working from detailed models that ensured consistency across multiple columns. The surface details, including facial features, costume elements, and weapon designs, were executed with remarkable precision, using specialized chisels that allowed for fine detail work on the hard basalt surfaces. The iconographic program embodied in these sculptural works reflected complex theological and political concepts that required specialized knowledge to interpret fully. Each warrior figure wore distinctive regalia that indicated specific military ranks and religious affiliations, while the weapons and ornaments they carried conveyed messages about Toltec military prowess and divine protection. The butterfly-shaped pectorals worn by the figures represented the souls of warriors who died in battle, connecting earthly military service to cosmic responsibilities and eternal rewards. The atlatls and dart bundles held by the warriors demonstrated the technological superiority that had enabled Toltec military expansion, while their stern facial expressions conveyed the discipline and determination that characterized elite Toltec military culture. The smaller-scale sculptural production that flourished throughout Toltec territory during this period shows the widespread dissemination of artistic techniques and iconographic systems that had been developed at the capital. Stone sculptures from provincial sites display the same technical competence and symbolic sophistication as metropolitan works, indicating that skilled craftsmen had established workshops throughout the Toltec sphere, or that finished works were being distributed from centralized production centers. These provincial sculptures often incorporated local materials and adapted standard iconographic programs to reflect regional religious practices and political relationships, creating artistic syntheses that enrich the overall Toltec cultural tradition. Relief sculptures that decorated architectural facades throughout Toltec territory demonstrate the integration of artistic production with monumental construction projects that transform the visual landscape of central Mexico. The carved panels that adorn the sides of Pyramid B at Tula established iconographic themes that were replicated at ceremonial centers throughout the Toltec sphere, creating visual connections that reinforced political and religious unity across diverse populations. These reliefs depicted processions of jaguars, eagles, and coyotes consuming human hearts, images that communicated messages about cosmic balance, ritual sacrifice, and the necessity of feeding the gods to maintain universal order. The technical execution of these relief sculptures required coordinated efforts by teams of specialized craftsmen who worked according to established templates and proportional systems. The consistency of figure proportions, decorative details, and compositional arrangements across different architectural contexts indicates that sculptors had access to detailed pattern books or master drawings that ensured uniformity in artistic production. The carving techniques employed show sophisticated understanding of how relief depth and surface texture would appear under different lighting conditions, with sculptors adjusting their approaches to create optimal visual effects for viewers approaching from various angles and distances. The pottery traditions that reached their full development during the Toltec imperial period represented one of the most significant achievements in Mesoamerican ceramic production, combining technical innovation with artistic sophistication that influenced pottery making throughout central Mexico. The Mazapan ceramic complex, which had emerged during the early phases of Toltec development, evolved into a comprehensive system of vessel forms, decorative techniques, and production methods that served both utilitarian and ceremonial functions. Archaeological evidence from ceramic workshops at Tula and other major sites reveals the scale and organization of pottery production, with specialized facilities capable of firing thousands of vessels simultaneously while maintaining consistent quality standards. The technical innovations that characterized mature Mazapan ceramics included improved clay preparation techniques, more sophisticated firing methods, and the development of new decorative approaches that expanded the artistic possibilities available to Toltec potters. Clay sources were carefully selected and processed, using standardized procedures that removed impurities and achieved optimal plasticity for different types of vessels. The addition of carefully measured temper materials, including crushed volcanic glass and ground pottery sherds, created ceramic paste with specific working properties and firing characteristics that allowed potters to produce vessels with predictable performance characteristics. The firing techniques employed by Toltec potters achieved unprecedented control over atmospheric conditions and temperature regulation, enabling the production of ceramics with consistent colors and surface finishes. Specialized kilns constructed at major production centers featured sophisticated airflow control systems and fuel management techniques that allowed potters to create reducing or oxidizing atmospheres as required for different decorative effects. The distinctive orange and red slip finishes that characterize Mazapan ceramics were achieved through careful control of iron oxide content and firing atmosphere, while the durability and water resistance of these surfaces made them highly desirable for both everyday use and long-distance trade. The decorative programs applied to Mazapan ceramics reflected the same iconographic themes and symbolic systems that appeared in monumental sculpture and architectural decoration, creating visual connections between different categories of material culture that reinforced shared cultural identity throughout the Toltec sphere. Geometric patterns, including step frets, parallel lines, and interlocking spirals, were executed with remarkable precision, using specialized brushes and painting techniques that achieved consistent line weights and color densities. More complex decorative schemes incorporated stylized animal forms, mythological figures, and religious symbols that required specialized knowledge to execute properly and interpret correctly. The vessel forms that characterized the Mazapan ceramic tradition included both utilitarian types designed for food preparation and storage, and ceremonial forms created specifically for religious activities and elite consumption. Cooking pots, storage jars, and serving bowls were produced in standardized sizes that facilitated food preparation and distribution in both household and institutional contexts. While their decorative treatments reflected social status and cultural affiliations of their users, ceremonial vessels included elaborate incense burners, offering bowls, and ritual containers that featured complex sculptural elements and iconographic programs that connected their use to specific religious practices and theological concepts. The distribution of Mazapan ceramics throughout Mesoamerica provides clear evidence for the extent of Toltec cultural influence and the effectiveness of their trade networks in disseminating artistic styles and cultural practices. Archaeological sites from northern Mexico to Central America have yielded Mazapan vessels or local imitations of Toltec ceramic styles, indicating that these pottery traditions were valued and emulated far beyond the boundaries of direct Toltec political control. The presence of Toltec-style ceramics in Maya, Huastec, and other regional contexts suggests that pottery served as both trade goods and cultural ambassadors that spread Toltec artistic influences through peaceful commercial relationships. The metallurgical traditions that developed during the Toltec period represented some of the earliest systematic metalworking in central Mexico, introducing new technologies and artistic possibilities that would later be adopted and expanded by subsequent Mesoamerican civilizations. While metal objects remained relatively rare compared to stone and ceramic artifacts, the technical sophistication achieved by Toltec metalworkers and the symbolic importance accorded to metal objects in religious and political contexts indicate that metallurgy had become an important component of elite material culture. Archaeological evidence from workshop areas at Tula and other sites reveals the techniques and tools employed by Toltec metalworkers, while the distribution of finished metal objects provides insights into their social and ceremonial functions. Copperworking represented the primary focus of Toltec metallurgical activities, with craftsmen developing sophisticated techniques for smelting, casting, and cold working this versatile metal. The raw copper required for these operations was obtained through trade networks that connected Toltec territories with copper-producing regions in western Mexico, particularly the areas around modern-day Michoacán, where rich ore deposits had been exploited since earlier periods. The transportation of copper ingots over hundreds of kilometers required well-organized commercial systems and represented significant investments in both time and resources that indicate the high value placed on metal objects by Toltec elites. The smelting techniques employed by Toltec metalworkers utilized ceramic furnaces designed to achieve the high temperatures necessary for copper extraction, while providing adequate airflow control for efficient combustion. These furnaces were typically constructed using specially prepared clay that could withstand repeated heating cycles without cracking, while bellows systems made from animal skins provided the forced air circulation necessary for maintaining optimal smelting conditions. The crucibles used for melting copper were crafted from heat-resistant ceramic materials and featured pouring spouts that allowed molten metal to be transferred to casting molds with precision and safety. The casting techniques developed by Toltec metalworkers enabled the production of complex three-dimensional objects that would have been difficult or impossible to create using other manufacturing methods. Stone and ceramic molds were carved with negative impressions of desired objects, allowing craftsmen to produce multiple copies of popular designs while maintaining consistent quality and proportions. The most common cast objects included bells, needles, tweezers, and decorative elements that were incorporated into clothing, jewelry, and ceremonial regalia. The distinctive sound quality of Toltec copper bells made them particularly valuable for religious ceremonies and public occasions, where acoustic effects were important for creating appropriate atmospheric conditions. The symbolic significance of metal objects in Toltec culture extended far beyond their practical utility, with copper and other metals being associated with solar deities, divine authority, and cosmic forces that connected earthly rulers to supernatural powers. Gold objects, though rare in Toltec contexts, were reserved for the most important ceremonial occasions and highest-ranking individuals. while their symbolic associations with solar energy and divine radiance made them essential components of royal regalia and religious paraphernalia. The integration of metal objects into larger artistic compositions, including stone sculptures and ceramic vessels, created multimedia artworks that demonstrated the technical virtuosity and symbolic sophistication of Toltec craftsmen. The architectural innovations that characterized the mature Toltec period represented systematic developments in construction techniques, spatial organization, and decorative integration that influenced building practices throughout Mesoamerica for centuries after the collapse of Toltec political power. The most distinctive of these innovations was the development of colonnaded halls that provided large interior spaces suitable for public gatherings, administrative activities, and ceremonial functions that required accommodation of substantial numbers of participants. These architectural solutions addressed practical needs for flexible interior spaces while creating impressive settings that enhanced the dignity and authority of Toltec political and religious institutions. The construction of colonnaded halls required sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles and the development of new techniques for creating stable roof systems supported by multiple columns rather than massive walls. Toltec architects solved these technical challenges by developing standardized column designs that could support substantial loads while maintaining architectural elegance and symbolic appropriateness. The columns themselves were constructed using stone drums fitted together with remarkable precision, while their capitals featured carved decorations that integrated structural and aesthetic functions in unified architectural compositions. The spatial organization of these colonnaded halls reflected careful attention to the functional requirements of different types of activities, while incorporating symbolic elements that reinforced appropriate social relationships and ceremonial protocols. Administrative halls featured arrangements of benches and platforms that accommodated hierarchical seating arrangements, while ceremonial spaces included specialized areas for ritual performances and religious observations. The acoustic properties of these spaces were carefully designed to enhance speech and music, with architectural features that amplified sound and controlled reverberation to create optimal conditions for public communication and ceremonial activities. The ball courts that were constructed at virtually every major Toltec site represented another significant architectural innovation that combined practical functions with complex symbolic meanings related to cosmic balance, ritual competition, and religious ceremony. These structures featured standardized proportions and construction techniques that created consistent playing conditions while accommodating the elaborate ceremonial activities that surrounded ball game performances. The architectural elements of Toltec ball courts, including sloping walls, end zones, and spectator areas, were designed to enhance both the athletic and ceremonial aspects of ball game activities while providing appropriate settings for the ritual sacrifices that often concluded these events. The construction techniques employed in ball court building demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both engineering principles and symbolic requirements that made these structures suitable for their complex functions. The playing surfaces were constructed using multiple layers of different materials that provided appropriate bounce characteristics for rubber balls while creating durable surfaces that could withstand intensive use. The sloping walls that flanked the playing alley were built using carefully fitted stone blocks that created smooth surfaces while incorporating drainage systems that prevented water accumulation during rainy seasons. The decorative programs that adorned Toltec ball courts reflected the complex mythological and religious associations of ball game activities, with carved reliefs depicting scenes of ritual competition, divine intervention, and cosmic significance that connected earthly games to universal themes of conflict and resolution. These sculptural programs often included representations of the hero twins and other mythological figures whose legendary ball game exploits provided divine precedents for human athletic competitions. The integration of these decorative elements with functional architectural features, created unified artistic compositions that enhanced both the visual impact and symbolic significance of ball court activities. The integration of military motifs into Toltec architectural decoration reflected the central role of warfare in their political system, while creating visual environments that constantly reinforced messages about military prowess, divine protection, and the cosmic significance of armed conflict. Relief sculptures depicting warriors, weapons, and battle scenes adorn the facades of both religious and secular buildings throughout Toltec territory, creating comprehensive iconographic programs that connected military activities to broader themes of cosmic order and divine authority. These decorative schemes served both aesthetic and propagandistic functions, enhancing architectural beauty while communicating political messages about Toltec power and legitimacy. The warrior imagery that dominated these architectural decorations featured standardized iconographic elements that were recognizable throughout the Toltec sphere, while allowing for regional variations that reflected local cultural traditions and political relationships. Eagle and jaguar warriors appeared frequently in these sculptural programs, their distinctive costumes and weapons serving as symbols of Toltec military organization and effectiveness. The depiction of specific weapons, armor types, and tactical formations provided detailed information about Toltec military technology, while creating visual records of their martial achievements that served both historical and propagandistic purposes. The pictographic writing systems that developed during the Toltec period represented significant advances in information storage and communication technologies that enabled more effective administration of their expanding territorial holdings, while preserving religious knowledge and historical records for future generations. Archaeological evidence from Toltec sites includes numerous examples of pictographic notation systems that were used for recording calendrical information, tribute obligations, and ceremonial requirements that required precise documentation for proper implementation. These writing systems built upon earlier Mesoamerican traditions, while introducing innovations that enhanced their capacity for recording complex information with greater precision and clarity. The development of standardized symbol systems allowed Toltec scribes to create documents that could be understood by trained readers throughout their territorial sphere, facilitating communication between administrative centers and enabling the coordination of complex political and economic activities across vast distances. The pictographic elements employed in these systems included both logographic symbols that represented entire words or concepts and phonetic elements that recorded specific sounds or syllables. This combination of writing principles provided flexibility and precision that made Toltec writing systems capable of recording both administrative data and literary compositions with equal effectiveness. The preservation of historical knowledge through written records enabled Toltec scholars to maintain detailed accounts of political events, military campaigns, and religious developments that provided foundations for later historical traditions throughout Mesoamerica. These records were maintained in specialized libraries and archives that were attached to major ceremonial centers and administrative facilities, where trained scribes copied important documents and updated records as new information became available. The systematic preservation of historical information created institutional memory that enhanced governmental effectiveness, while providing cultural continuity that survived the eventual collapse of Toltec political power. The religious knowledge preserved through Toltec writing systems included detailed information about ceremonial procedures, mythological narratives, and theological concepts that required precise documentation for proper transmission to future generations of priests and scholars. Sacred books containing this information were maintained in temple libraries, where they served as reference materials for conducting ceremonies and training new religious personnel. The standardization of religious writing ensured that ceremonial practices remained consistent across different regions and time periods, while the preservation of mythological traditions provided cultural foundations that influenced Mesoamerican religious thought long after the end of Toltec political dominance. The cultural synthesis that occurred throughout the Toltec sphere represented one of the most significant achievements of their imperial system, creating unified cultural traditions that incorporated diverse regional elements while maintaining distinctive Toltec characteristics that provided identity and cohesion for their far-flung territories. This synthesis process involved the systematic integration of local artistic traditions, religious practices, and technological innovations into comprehensive cultural systems that enhanced rather than replaced existing traditions. Archaeological evidence from throughout the Toltec sphere shows the results of this cultural integration, with regional sites displaying combinations of local and metropolitan characteristics that created rich cultural traditions adapted to specific geographical and social conditions. The blending of various Mesoamerican traditions under Toltec influence created new forms of artistic expression, religious practice, and technological innovation that enriched the cultural heritage of central Mexico, while providing models for cultural integration that would influence later imperial systems. The success of this cultural synthesis depended on Toltec willingness to adopt and adapt useful elements from conquered territories while providing attractive incentives for local populations to participate in the broader cultural system. This approach created dynamic cultural traditions that continued to evolve throughout the period of Toltec dominance while maintaining enough consistency to provide unified identity for diverse populations. The cultural synthesis that had transformed Toltec territories into unified regional traditions operated within an economic framework of unprecedented sophistication that enabled the sustained prosperity necessary for their imperial achievements. The agricultural foundation of this economic system rested upon innovations in farming techniques, irrigation technology, and crop management that maximized productivity in the challenging semi-arid environment of central Mexico, while supporting urban populations that had grown to sizes previously unknown in the region. Archaeological investigations throughout the Tula River Valley have revealed extensive networks of terraced fields, irrigation canals, and water management systems that demonstrate the scale and technical sophistication of Toltec agricultural development during the height of their power. The terraced farming systems that transformed the hillsides around Tolan-Tecocatitlan represented engineering achievements that required coordinated labor efforts and sophisticated understanding of soil management, water flow, and erosion control. These agricultural terraces were constructed using carefully fitted stone retaining walls that created level planting surfaces on steep slopes while preventing soil loss during seasonal rains. The terraces themselves were filled with fertile soil transported from river bottoms and enriched with organic matter from household refuse and human waste, creating productive agricultural plots that could support intensive cultivation of maize, beans, squash, and other essential crops. The construction of these terrace systems required detailed topographical surveys and hydraulic engineering that connected individual field units to comprehensive drainage networks capable of managing water flow during both dry and rainy seasons. Stone-lined channels carried water from springs and streams to storage reservoirs positioned at strategic elevations throughout the terrace systems, while carefully calculated gradients ensured adequate water pressure for irrigation, while preventing erosion of field surfaces. The most sophisticated of these systems included adjustable gates and diversion structures that allowed farmers to control water distribution according to seasonal needs and crop requirements. Archaeological evidence from agricultural areas around Tula reveals the tools and techniques employed by Toltec farmers to maximize crop yields while maintaining soil fertility over extended periods. Specialized agricultural implements included wooden digging sticks tipped with bronze or hardened wood points, stone hoes for breaking up compacted soil, and harvesting knives with obsidian blades that could efficiently cut mature grain stalks. The standardization of tool designs throughout Toltec agricultural areas indicates that farming techniques were systematically taught and disseminated, while the quality of construction suggests that agricultural equipment was produced by specialized craftsmen rather than individual farmers. The crop rotation systems employed by Toltec farmers demonstrated sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry and plant nutrition that enabled sustained high yields without depleting soil fertility. Archaeological analysis of ancient field surfaces reveals evidence for systematic alternation between nitrogen-fixing legumes and nutrient-demanding grain crops, while the incorporation of amaranth, chili peppers, and other supplementary plants provided dietary diversity and additional sources of essential nutrients. The timing of planting and harvesting activities was coordinated with astronomical observations and ceremonial calendars that ensured optimal growing conditions, while maintaining proper ritual relationships between agricultural activities and religious observances. The irrigation systems that supplied water to agricultural areas throughout Toltec territory represented some of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering achievements in ancient America, requiring detailed understanding of topography, hydrology, and construction techniques that enabled effective water management across diverse geographical conditions. The primary irrigation network serving the Tula River Valley began with stone-lined intake structures that diverted water from the main river channel into distribution canals that carried water to elevated storage reservoirs positioned throughout the agricultural zone. These reservoirs were constructed using waterproof clay linings and stone spillways that prevented overflow damage while maintaining adequate water supplies during dry periods. The distribution networks that carried water from storage reservoirs to individual fields featured sophisticated control mechanisms that allowed farmers to regulate water flow according to crop needs and seasonal conditions. Bronze or wooden gates positioned at strategic points throughout the canal system could be opened or closed to direct water to specific field areas, while stone-lined measuring devices ensured that water allocation followed established protocols that prevented conflicts between neighbouring farmers. The maintenance of these irrigation systems required coordinated labour efforts that were organised through community work groups supervised by hydraulic specialists who possessed the technical knowledge necessary for system operation and repair. The agricultural productivity achieved through these intensive farming systems provided the economic foundation for craft specialization and urban development that characterized Toltec civilization during its imperial period. Archaeological evidence indicates that agricultural surpluses were sufficient to support substantial non-agricultural populations engaged in craft production, trade, administration, and military service, while the reliability of food supplies enabled long-term planning and investment in monumental construction projects and territorial expansion. The systematic storage and distribution of agricultural products required sophisticated facilities and administrative systems that connected rural producers with urban consumers through networks of markets, warehouses, and transportation systems. Craft production during the mature Toltec period achieved levels of specialization and technical sophistication that transformed manufacturing from household-based activities into organized industries capable of supplying both local needs and regional trade networks. The obsidian tool industry that had emerged during earlier periods expanded dramatically during the 11th and 12th centuries, with workshop complexes at Tula and other major sites producing standardized implements in quantities that supplied markets throughout Mesoamerica. Archaeological excavations at these production centers have revealed the scale and organization of obsidian working, with specialized areas for different stages of the manufacturing process and evidence for quality control systems that ensured consistent product standards. The procurement of raw obsidian for these manufacturing operations required extensive trade networks that connected Toltec workshops with quarry sites located hundreds of kilometers from major population centers. The most important obsidian sources included the Sierra de las Navajas deposits northeast of Tula, the Otumba sources in the basin of Mexico, and more distant quarries in Hidalgo and Puebla that provided different types of obsidian with varying properties suitable for different tool types. The transportation of raw obsidian from these sources to manufacturing centres involved organised expeditions that included armed guards, pack animals, and specialised equipment for extracting and preparing stone for transport. The workshop organisation that developed at major obsidian production centres demonstrates the emergence of sophisticated manufacturing systems that coordinated the activities of numerous specialised craftsmen working in coordinated production sequences. Master knappers who possessed the advanced skills necessary for creating prismatic blade cores supervised teams of apprentices and journeymen who performed preliminary shaping, core preparation, and blade removal operations according to standardized procedures. The most skilled craftsmen specialized in producing ceremonial objects, including ornate knives, mirrors, and sculptural elements that required exceptional technical ability and artistic sensibility. The quality control systems implemented in these workshops ensured that finished products met consistent standards for dimensions, edge sharpness, and durability that made Toltec obsidian tools highly valued throughout Mesoamerica. Rejected blades and defective tools were systematically recycled through secondary manufacturing processes that produced smaller implements or were incorporated into composite tools that combined obsidian, cutting edges with wooden or bone handles. The standardization achieved through these production systems enabled Toltec manufacturers to compete effectively with producers in other regions, while building reputations for reliability and quality that facilitated long-distance trade relationships. The ceramic industry that flourished throughout Toltec territory during this period represented another major craft specialization that combined technical innovation with artistic achievement to create products that served both utilitarian and ceremonial functions. The expansion of pottery production beyond the Mazapan tradition that had characterized earlier periods involved the development of new vessel forms, decorative techniques, and firing methods that reflected both technological advancement and changing social needs. Archaeological evidence from ceramic workshops reveals the scale of production operations, with specialized kilns capable of firing hundreds of vessels simultaneously, and standardized clay preparation facilities that ensured consistent material properties. The clay sources utilized by Toltec potters were carefully selected and systematically exploited through organized extraction operations that supplied raw materials to workshops throughout the region. The most productive clay deposits were located along river terraces and lake shores, where geological processes had created deposits with optimal plasticity and firing characteristics. While the transportation of clay to manufacturing centers required coordinated logistics that ensured adequate supplies during peak production periods. The preparation of clay for pottery making involved systematic processing that removed impurities, adjusted plasticity through the addition of temper materials, and created standardized clay bodies suitable for different types of vessels. The expansion of ceramic production to serve growing urban populations and expanding trade networks required innovations in kiln design and firing techniques that enabled more efficient and predictable pottery manufacture. The kilns constructed at major production centres featured sophisticated airflow control systems that allowed potters to create specific atmospheric conditions necessary for different decorative effects, while improved fuel management techniques reduced firing costs and environmental impacts. The development of standardized firing procedures enabled potters to achieve consistent results across large production runs while maintaining the quality standards necessary for both local consumption and export markets. Textile production represented one of the most economically significant craft specializations in Toltec society, providing both everyday clothing and luxury goods that served important social and ceremonial functions. Archaeological evidence from textile workshops includes numerous spindle whorls, loom weights, and other weaving implements that demonstrate the scale and organisation of cloth manufacturing throughout Toltec territory. The raw materials required for textile production included cotton fibres obtained through trade networks extending to tropical regions, maguey fibres extracted from local agave plants, and animal fibres from domesticated rabbits, and imported materials that provided different textures and properties suitable for various types of textiles. The techniques employed by Toltec weavers achieved remarkable sophistication in both technical execution and artistic design, creating textiles that combined functional durability with aesthetic beauty that made them valuable trade goods throughout Mesoamerica. The most skilled weavers specialized in producing elaborate ceremonial textiles decorated with feathered designs, geometric patterns, and symbolic motifs that required exceptional technical ability and cultural knowledge to execute properly. These luxury textiles were reserved for elite consumption and religious ceremonies, while standardized production methods supplied everyday clothing needs for the general population. The dyeing techniques that created the distinctive colors characteristic of Toltec textiles involved the systematic exploitation of various plant and animal sources that provided pigments with specific color properties and fastness characteristics. The most valuable dyes included cochineal red obtained from insects cultivated on prickly pear cacti, indigo blue extracted from specialized plants, and various yellow and brown dyes derived from tree barks and mineral sources. The preparation and application of these dyes required specialized knowledge and equipment that made dye production a distinct craft specialization within the broader textile industry. The long-distance trade networks that connected Toltec territories with regions throughout Mesoamerica represented one of their most significant achievements, creating commercial relationships that extended their cultural influence far beyond the boundaries of direct political control, while providing access to exotic materials and products that enhanced elite lifestyles and ceremonial practices. Archaeological evidence for these trade networks includes the widespread distribution of Toltec-produced goods and the presence of foreign materials in Toltec contexts that demonstrate the scale and effectiveness of their commercial operations. The organization of long-distance trade required sophisticated logistical planning, diplomatic relationships, and military protection that made commerce an integral component of Toltec imperial strategy. The trade routes that connected Toltec territories with the Maya lowlands of Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula created some of the most important commercial relationships in Mesoamerican history, facilitating exchanges of goods, ideas, and technologies that enriched both civilizations, while creating cultural syntheses that influenced regional development for centuries. Toltec merchants traveling to Maya regions carried obsidian tools, ceramic vessels, and metal objects that were highly valued by Maya elites, while returning with jade ornaments, cacao beans, exotic feathers, and other luxury goods that were essential components of Toltec ceremonial and political culture. The establishment of trading relationships with Maya city-states required diplomatic negotiations and the development of commercial protocols that ensured safe passage for merchant caravans while providing mutual benefits for participating communities. Archaeological evidence from Maya sites shows the presence of Toltec-style buildings and artifacts that may represent permanent trading establishments or diplomatic compounds where Toltec merchants maintained operations during extended stays in foreign territories. The integration of Toltec architectural and artistic elements into Maya ceremonial centers indicates that commercial relationships involved cultural exchange that extended far beyond simple commodity transactions. The trade networks that extended westward to the Pacific coast regions of modern-day Guerrero and Oaxaca provided Toltec merchants with access to marine resources, tropical products, and specialized craft goods that were unavailable in central Mexican environments. The most important of these trade goods included marine shells that were essential components of Toltec religious ceremonies, salt that was necessary for food preservation and processing, and exotic bird feathers that were required for elite ceremonial costumes and religious regalia. The transportation of these goods across the mountainous terrain between the Pacific coast and central Mexico required specialized knowledge of routes, seasonal conditions, and local political relationships that made long-distance trade a highly skilled profession. The merchant expeditions that maintained these Pacific coast trade relationships operated according to seasonal schedules that coordinated commercial activities with agricultural cycles and ceremonial calendars that governed both Toltec and local community activities. The timing of trading expeditions was crucial for ensuring that merchants arrived at coastal communities during periods when desired products were available and local populations were able to engage in commercial activities. The development of standardized exchange rates and measurement systems facilitated transactions between communities with different economic systems and cultural traditions. The northern trade routes that connected Toltec territories with the emerging civilizations of the American Southwest created commercial relationships that extended Toltec influence into regions that had previously maintained limited contact with Mesoamerican civilizations. These trade networks carried Toltec goods, including pottery, obsidian tools, and luxury items to Pueblo communities in modern-day New Mexico and Arizona, while bringing back turquoise, copper, and other materials that were highly valued in Mesoamerican contexts. The archaeological evidence for these trade relationships includes the presence of Mesoamerican-style artifacts at southwestern sites and turquoise ornaments in Toltec, ceremonial contexts that demonstrate the success of these long-distance commercial operations. The market systems that developed within Toltec territories provided the institutional framework for distributing both locally produced goods and imported materials to consumers throughout their sphere of influence. Archaeological evidence from market areas at Tula and other major sites reveals the physical infrastructure that supported commercial activities, including specialized storage facilities, standardized measurement devices, and administrative areas where market officials regulated trading activities and collected taxes or fees from participating merchants. The organization of these markets required sophisticated administrative systems that maintained order, prevented fraud, and ensured that commercial activities contributed appropriately to state revenues. The tribute collection systems that extracted resources from conquered territories represented a crucial component of Toltec economic organization, providing the wealth necessary for supporting administrative bureaucracies, military forces, and monumental construction projects that maintained imperial power and prestige. The tribute obligations imposed on subject communities were carefully calculated to extract maximum resources without creating economic hardship that might provoke rebellion or population flight. Archaeological evidence from tribute-paying communities shows the construction of specialized facilities for producing, processing, and storing tribute goods, while administrative records preserved in later sources provide detailed information about tribute schedules and collection procedures. The role of Poctessa, the professional long-distance merchants who served as both commercial agents and diplomatic representatives for Toltec authorities, represented one of the most distinctive features of their economic system. These specialized merchants possessed the linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and political connections necessary for conducting business in foreign territories, while serving as intelligence agents and diplomatic intermediaries who facilitated political relationships between Toltec authorities and foreign rulers. The Pochteca maintained their own residential quarters within major Toltec cities, where they stored trade goods, trained apprentices, and conducted the religious ceremonies that ensured divine protection for their dangerous journeys. The training and organization of Pochteca merchants required years of preparation that included instruction in foreign languages, commercial practices, diplomatic protocols, and the geographic and political knowledge necessary for successful long-distance trading expeditions. Young merchants served lengthy apprenticeships under experienced Pochteca, who taught them the specialized skills and cultural knowledge required for their profession, while the merchant organizations maintained their own religious institutions, legal systems, and social hierarchies that provided structure and support for their members' commercial activities. The sophisticated merchant networks and diplomatic relationships that had extended Toltec influence throughout Mesoamerica during the height of their imperial power created the conditions for one of the most remarkable cultural encounters in pre-Columbian history. The arrival of Toltec traders, warriors, and possibly political refugees in the northern Yucatan Peninsula during the late 10th and early 11th centuries initiated a period of intensive cultural exchange that would transform Maya civilization while creating architectural and artistic syntheses that continue to puzzle scholars today. The site of Chichen Itza, already an important Maya ceremonial center, became the focal point of this cultural fusion, developing into a cosmopolitan city that combined Maya astronomical knowledge with Toltec military traditions, Maya architectural techniques with Central Mexican iconographic programs, and Maya political structures with Toltec concepts of imperial authority. Archaeological investigations at Chichen Itza have revealed a complex sequence of construction phases that document the gradual integration of Toltec elements into existing Maya architectural traditions. The earliest evidence for Central Mexican influence appears in ceramic assemblages dating to approximately 950 AD, when fine orange pottery and other trade goods from the Gulf Coast regions began appearing in significant quantities alongside traditional Maya ceramics. These early imports suggest that commercial relationships between Yucatecan Maya communities and Central Mexican populations were well established before the period of intensive Toltec influence that would transform the site's architectural character. The most dramatic evidence for Toltec presence at Chichen Itza comes from the construction of the Temple of Kukulkan, a stepped pyramid that displays remarkable architectural and iconographic similarities to structures at Tollan-Xicocoatitlan, while incorporating distinctively Maya astronomical alignments and proportional systems. This monument, rising to a height of 24 meters and measuring 55.5 meters on each side at its base, represents a sophisticated synthesis of architectural traditions that require detailed knowledge of both Maya and Toltec construction techniques. The pyramid's 9 terraced levels and 4 stairways create a total of 365 steps when including the platform temple, corresponding to the solar year and demonstrating the continuation of Maya astronomical traditions within the new architectural framework. The iconographic program that decorates the Temple of Kukulkan reveals the systematic integration of Central Mexican religious symbols with Maya theological concepts, creating visual narratives that would have been comprehensible to audiences familiar with both cultural traditions. Feathered serpent motifs carved on the pyramid's balustrades combine Quetzalcoatl imagery from central Mexico with Maya representations of Kukulkan, the Yucatecan version of the feathered serpent deity. The heads of these serpents, positioned at the base of the northern stairway, are illuminated by shadow patterns during the spring and autumn equinoxes, creating the famous serpent of light effect that demonstrates the continued importance of astronomical observations in Maya religious practice. The Temple of the Warriors complex at Chichen Itza provides even more dramatic evidence for direct Toltec architectural influence, featuring colonnaded halls and sculptural programs that closely parallel structures at Tula while adapting these forms to Maya building traditions and local limestone construction materials. The main temple structure, supported by carved columns depicting Toltec-style warriors, reproduces the basic architectural concept of Temple B at Tula, while incorporating Maya corbel vaulting techniques and proportional systems that reflect local architectural preferences. The warriors depicted on these columns wear the same distinctive regalia seen on the Atlantean columns at Tula, including butterfly pectorals, feathered headdresses and atlatl weapons, but their facial features and some decorative details show Maya stylistic influences, that suggest local craftsmen were involved in their creation. The Great Bull Court at Chichen Itza represents the largest and most elaborate bull court in Mesoamerica, measuring 168 meters in length and featuring architectural elements and sculptural decorations that combine Maya and Toltec traditions in unprecedented ways. The court's basic design follows Maya architectural principles, with sloping walls and end zones that create optimal playing conditions for the rubber ball game, but the relief sculptures that decorate these walls display iconographic programs that draw heavily upon Central Mexican artistic traditions. The most famous of these reliefs depicts the ritual sacrifice that concluded bull game competitions, showing players dressed in Toltec-style regalia, while incorporating Maya glyphic texts that provide additional information about the ceremonial context of these events. The acoustic properties of the Great Bull Court demonstrate sophisticated understanding of sound engineering that enhanced both the athletic and ceremonial functions of this structure. Conversations conducted in normal speaking voices at one end of the court can be clearly heard at the opposite end, while hand claps produce distinctive echo effects that would have enhanced the dramatic impact of ceremonial activities. These acoustic features appear to have been deliberately engineered through careful attention to wall angles, surface textures, and spatial proportions that created optimal sound transmission and reverberation characteristics. The sculptural programs that decorate the walls of the Great Bull Court provide detailed documentation of the ritual activities that took place in this space, while revealing the complex cultural synthesis that characterized Chichen Itza during its period of Toltec influence. The central panel depicts two teams of bull players, with the captain of the winning team holding the severed head of the losing captain, while blood flowing from the neck transforms into serpents and flowering vines. This imagery combines Maya concepts of ritual sacrifice with Central Mexican symbolism relating to agricultural fertility and cosmic regeneration, creating visual narratives that would have conveyed complex theological messages to audiences familiar with both cultural traditions. The group of 1,000 columns adjacent to the Temple of the Warriors provides additional evidence for the scale and sophistication of Toltec architectural influence at Chichen Itza, featuring extensive colonnaded spaces that created covered areas suitable for markets, administrative activities, and public gatherings. These structures represent direct adaptations of architectural forms that had been developed at Tula for similar functions, but their construction using local limestone and Maya building techniques created hybrid architectural forms that combined Central Mexican spatial concepts with Yucatecan material traditions. The columns themselves feature carved decorations that include both Toltec warrior imagery and Maya glyphic inscriptions, demonstrating the bilingual and bicultural nature of the artistic programs created during this period of cultural synthesis. The astronomical alignments incorporated into Toltec-influenced structures at Chichen Itza reveal the continued importance of Maya scientific knowledge, even as architectural forms and iconographic programs were being transformed through contact with Central Mexican traditions. The caracol, a circular structure that served as an astronomical observatory, combines Maya mathematical precision with architectural elements that show clear Toltec influence, including the use of columns and the integration of feathered serpent motifs into its decorative program. The building's windows and doorways are precisely aligned to frame the appearances of Venus at its maximum elongations, while other openings correspond to lunar and solar events that were crucial for Maya calendar keeping and ceremonial scheduling. The integration of Toltec military symbolism into Maya architectural contexts reflects the adoption of Central Mexican concepts of warfare and political authority that transformed traditional Maya approaches to rulership and territorial control. Relief sculptures throughout Chichen Itza depict warriors equipped with Toltec-style weapons and armor, including atlatls, obsidian-edged clubs, and cotton armor that provided superior protection compared to traditional Maya military equipment. These military innovations appear to have been accompanied by changes in political organization that emphasized centralized authority and territorial expansion rather than the more fragmented city-state system that had characterized earlier Maya political development. The evidence for actual Toltec presence at Chichen Itza extends beyond architectural and artistic influence to include material culture assemblages that suggest the establishment of central Mexican populations within the Maya community. Ceramic vessels produced in Toltec styles using local clays and tempering materials indicate that central Mexican pottery traditions were being practiced by resident craftsmen rather than simply imported as finished goods. Similarly, obsidian tools found at the site show the application of Toltec manufacturing techniques to raw materials obtained from both Central Mexican and Maya sources, suggesting that specialized craftsmen with knowledge of both technological traditions were working within integrated production systems. The chronological relationship between Toltec influence at Chichen Itza and the political upheavals that affected Tollan-Titlan during the late 10th century has generated considerable scholarly debate about the mechanisms through which cultural transmission occurred. Some researchers argue that the arrival of C.E. Acatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl and his followers at Chichen Itza following their exile from Tula provides the most plausible explanation for the sudden appearance of intensive Toltec influence at the Maya site. This interpretation is supported by the timing of architectural changes at Chichen Itza, which correspond closely to the period of political crisis at Tula, and by the emphasis on Quetzalcoatl Kukulkan imagery in the new construction programs. Alternative interpretations suggest that Toltec influence at Chichen Itza resulted from gradual cultural diffusion through trade networks and diplomatic relationships, rather than the arrival of specific political refugees or military conquerors. Archaeological evidence for commercial relationships between central Mexico and the Maya regions extends back several centuries before the period of intensive architectural influence, while the selective adoption of Toltec elements suggests that Maya rulers were making deliberate choices about which foreign innovations to incorporate into their own cultural traditions. The continued use of Maya architectural techniques and the integration of local astronomical knowledge into new construction programs support interpretations that emphasize Maya agency in the cultural synthesis process. The debate over the nature of Toltec-Maya interactions at Chichen Itza reflects broader questions about the mechanisms of cultural change in ancient Mesoamerica and the ways in which different civilizations influenced each other through contact and exchange. The archaeological evidence reveals clear patterns of cultural borrowing and adaptation, but the specific historical processes through which these changes occurred remain difficult to reconstruct with certainty. The integration of foreign elements into existing cultural systems appears to have been a selective process that involved conscious decisions by local populations about which innovations to adopt and how to adapt them to local conditions and preferences. The linguistic evidence for Toltec influence in the Maya region includes the adoption of Nahuatl loanwords into Yucatec Maya vocabulary, particularly terms relating to military equipment, political organization, and religious concepts that were associated with central Mexican cultural traditions. The word Kukulkan itself appears to be derived from the Nahuatl Quetzalcoatl, while other Nahuatl borrowings include terms for specific types of weapons, architectural elements, and ceremonial objects that were introduced during the period of intensive cultural contact. The preservation of these loanwords in modern Maya languages provides additional evidence for the historical reality of cultural exchange between central Mexican and Maya populations. The religious synthesis that occurred at Chichen Itza involved the integration of central Mexican deities and ceremonial practices into Maya theological systems in ways that created new forms of religious expression, while maintaining continuity with earlier Maya traditions. The worship of Kukulkan incorporated elements of Quetzalcoatl mythology and ceremonial practice, while adapting these traditions to Maya astronomical knowledge and agricultural cycles. Similarly, the adoption of central Mexican military rituals and warrior societies was integrated with Maya concepts of rulership and divine authority to create new forms of political legitimation that combined elements from both cultural traditions. The impact of Toltec influence on Maya artistic traditions extended beyond architectural decoration to encompass changes in ceramic production, textile design, and sculptural style that created new forms of artistic expression throughout the northern Yucatan. Maya potters began producing vessels that combined traditional Maya forms with decorative motifs derived from central Mexican artistic traditions, while textile workers incorporated new dyes, weaving techniques, and design elements that had been introduced through contact with Toltec craftsmen. These artistic innovations spread throughout the Maya region through trade networks and cultural exchange, influencing artistic production at sites far from Chichen Itza itself. The economic implications of Toltec presence at Chichen Itza included the development of new trade relationships that connected the Maya region more directly to central Mexican commercial networks, while providing access to exotic goods and raw materials that had previously been difficult to obtain. The establishment of Toltec merchants at the site appears to have facilitated trade in obsidian, metals, and other central Mexican products, while Maya merchants gained improved access to northern trade routes that connected the Yucatan with regions as distant as the American Southwest. These expanded commercial relationships contributed to the economic prosperity that supported the massive construction programs undertaken at Chichen Itza during its period of Toltec influence. The agricultural innovations that accompanied Toltec influence in the Maya region included the introduction of new crops, farming techniques, and water management systems that enhanced food production and supported larger populations in areas that had previously been limited by environmental constraints. Central Mexican knowledge of irrigation technology and soil management was adapted to Yucatecan environmental conditions, while the introduction of new plant varieties provided dietary diversity and improved nutrition for local populations. These agricultural improvements contributed to the demographic growth that characterized the northern Yucatan during the Terminal Classic period. The fortification systems that were constructed at Chichen Itza and other Maya sites during this period reflect the adoption of central Mexican military technologies and defensive strategies that transformed Maya approaches to warfare and territorial control. These fortifications included walls, moats, and defensive structures that incorporated Toltec engineering techniques, while adapting to local topographic conditions and available construction materials. The scale and sophistication of these defensive works suggest that the period of cultural contact was accompanied by increased military activity and territorial competition that required new approaches to settlement defense and population protection. The influence of Toltec political concepts on Maya governmental systems appears to have contributed to the development of more centralized forms of authority that differed significantly from the traditional Maya city-state organization. Archaeological evidence from Chichen Itza suggests the emergence of rulers who claimed authority over larger territories and more diverse populations than had been typical of earlier Maya political systems. These changes in political organization were accompanied by new forms of royal imagery and ceremonial practice that incorporated central Mexican symbols of authority while maintaining connections to traditional Maya concepts of divine kingship. The scholarly debates surrounding Toltec influence at Chichen Itza continue to evolve as new archaeological evidence becomes available and as researchers develop more sophisticated approaches to understanding cultural interaction and change in ancient Mesoamerica. Recent excavations have provided additional data about the chronology and mechanisms of cultural contact, while advances in analytical techniques have enabled more precise identification of trade goods and their sources. These ongoing investigations continue to refine our understanding of one of the most significant episodes of cultural exchange in pre-Columbian American history, revealing the complexity and sophistication of the processes through which different civilizations influenced and enriched each other through contact and interaction. The ongoing scholarly investigations into Toltec Maya cultural exchange at Chichen Itza were occurring against a backdrop of mounting pressures that would ultimately undermine the foundations of Toltec imperial power. By 1100 AD, the sophisticated economic networks, military systems, and administrative structures that had sustained Toltec dominance across central Mexico for over a century were beginning to show signs of strain under the combined weight of environmental challenges, internal political conflicts, and external military pressures that would prove increasingly difficult to manage through traditional imperial strategies. The environmental crisis that began to affect central Mexico during the early 12th century represented the most serious challenge to Toltec agricultural productivity since the establishment of their intensive farming systems around Tollan-Xicocotitlan. Paleoclimatological evidence from lake sediments, tree rings, and other environmental indicators reveals a pattern of decreasing rainfall and increasing temperature variability that created drought conditions lasting several consecutive growing seasons. The sophisticated irrigation networks and terraced farming systems that had supported large urban populations became increasingly inadequate as water sources diminished and crop yields declined throughout the Tula River Valley and surrounding agricultural regions. Archaeological evidence from agricultural areas around Tula documents the desperate measures undertaken by Toltec farmers to maintain food production as environmental conditions deteriorated. Excavations reveal the construction of additional water storage facilities, the expansion of existing irrigation canals to tap more distant water sources, and the modification of terraced fields to maximize water retention during brief rainy periods. Stone-lined wells were dug to unprecedented depths in attempts to reach groundwater sources that had previously been accessible through surface springs, while the construction of covered storage facilities increased dramatically as communities sought to preserve grain supplies through extended periods of scarcity. The agricultural crisis created cascading effects throughout Toltec economic and political systems that proved impossible to resolve through traditional administrative responses. Urban populations that had grown accustomed to reliable food supplies from rural agricultural areas began experiencing shortages that led to social unrest and challenges to established authority structures. The archaeological deposits from residential areas at Tula show evidence of dietary stress, including increased consumption of wild plants and animals that had not been significant food sources during periods of agricultural abundance. Skeletal remains from this period reveal nutritional deficiencies and growth stunting that indicate prolonged periods of inadequate food intake across all social classes. The tribute collection systems that had provided essential resources for maintaining imperial administration and military forces became increasingly difficult to sustain as agricultural productivity declined throughout Toltec territory. Communities that had previously met their tribute obligations without difficulty found themselves unable to produce the required quantities of grain, textiles, and other goods, while maintaining adequate supplies for local consumption. Archaeological evidence from tribute-paying settlements shows the abandonment of specialized production facilities and the conversion of craft workshops to food storage areas, as communities prioritize survival over the manufacture of goods for regional exchange networks. The breakdown of tribute collection created fiscal crises that undermined the ability of Toltec administrators to maintain the military forces, public works projects, and ceremonial activities that legitimize their political authority. Construction activities at major ceremonial centers throughout Toltec territory slowed dramatically during the early 12th century, with many building projects left incomplete as resources were diverted to more immediate survival needs. The maintenance of existing infrastructure, including roads, irrigation systems, and public buildings, suffered as labor and materials became increasingly scarce, and communities focused their efforts on local food production and defense. Internal political conflicts that had been suppressed or managed through successful imperial expansion began to resurface as environmental pressures reduced the resources available for maintaining political unity. The warrior nobility that had formed the backbone of Toltec military expansion found their traditional sources of wealth and prestige threatened by the economic disruptions caused by agricultural failures. Archaeological evidence from elite residential compounds at Tula shows reduced construction activity, simplified architectural decoration, and changes in burial practices that suggest declining wealth and status among traditional ruling families. The religious institutions that had provided ideological legitimacy for Toltec imperial authority faced increasing challenges as environmental disasters raised questions about the effectiveness of traditional ceremonial practices and the divine favour supposedly enjoyed by Toltec rulers. The elaborate ritual calendar that had coordinated agricultural, military and ceremonial activities throughout the empire became increasingly difficult to maintain as communities struggled to provide the resources necessary for proper observance of religious festivals. Archaeological evidence from temple complexes shows reduced offerings, simplified ceremonial equipment, and the abandonment of some religious facilities as communities could no longer support the full range of traditional ritual activities. The factional struggles that emerged during this period of crisis reflected fundamental disagreements about how to respond to the mounting challenges facing Toltec society. Conservative factions advocated for increased emphasis on traditional religious practices and military solutions, arguing that more intensive ritual observance and aggressive expansion could restore divine favour and access to new resources. Progressive factions promoted adaptation and reform, suggesting that survival required fundamental changes in political organisation, economic strategies, and territorial policies that would enable more effective responses to environmental and demographic pressures. Archaeological evidence for these internal conflicts includes the fortification of previously undefended settlements, the construction of defensive walls around residential areas, and the appearance of weapon caches in contexts that suggest preparation for internal warfare rather than external campaigns. The distribution of military equipment shows changes in supply patterns that indicate disruption of centralized production and distribution systems, while the appearance of locally manufactured weapons with non-standard designs suggests that communities were increasingly relying on their own resources for military equipment. The fragmentation of political authority that resulted from these internal conflicts created opportunities for external groups to challenge Toltec territorial control and exploit the weaknesses created by imperial overextension. The Chichimek peoples who inhabited the northern frontiers of Toltec territory had been contained through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic accommodation that required constant attention and substantial resource investments. As Toltec military capabilities declined due to internal problems and resource shortages, these northern groups began launching increasingly aggressive raids against Toltec settlements and trade routes. The Chichimek raiders who began penetrating Toltec territory during the early 12th century represented diverse groups of semi-nomadic peoples who possessed superior mobility and knowledge of local terrain that gave them significant advantages over the increasingly static Toltec defensive systems. Archaeological evidence from frontier settlements shows repeated episodes of destruction and abandonment as communities proved unable to defend themselves against these mobile raiders. The fortified outposts that had previously controlled access routes into Toltec territory were systematically attacked and often abandoned, creating gaps in defensive coverage that allowed deeper penetration by hostile forces. The military innovations employed by Chichimek raiders included improved bow technology that provided superior range and accuracy compared to traditional Toltec atlatl weapons, while their use of horseback mobility gave them tactical advantages that Toltec military commanders found difficult to counter. Archaeological evidence from battle sites reveals the adoption of new types of projectile points designed for bow use, while the remains of defensive installations show modifications intended to counter mounted attackers. The speed and unpredictability of Chichimec raids made it difficult for Toltec forces to respond effectively, while the raiders' ability to disappear into familiar terrain after attacks prevented effective retaliation. The economic disruption caused by Chichimec raiding extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on attacked settlements to encompass broader effects on trade networks, agricultural production, and resource allocation throughout northern Toltec territory. Merchant caravans travelling to and from northern trading partners faced increasing risks that made long-distance commerce increasingly unprofitable, while the military escorts required for protecting trade expeditions diverted resources from other essential activities. Agricultural communities in frontier areas were forced to abandon outlying fields and concentrate their activities in defensible locations, reducing overall food production and creating additional pressure on already strained supply systems. The response strategies attempted by Toltec military commanders included the construction of additional fortifications, the establishment of more frequent patrols, and attempts to negotiate treaties with Chichimec leaders that would reduce raiding activities in exchange for tribute payments or trade concessions. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these diplomatic initiatives achieved temporary success, with certain Chichimec groups apparently agreeing to serve as allies against other raiders in exchange for access to Toltec trade goods and recognition of their territorial claims. However, the fundamental mismatch between Chichimec mobility and Toltec defensive strategies made it impossible to achieve lasting security through military means alone. The pressure from other competing powers in central Mexico created additional challenges for Toltec authorities, who were already struggling with internal problems and northern raiders. The various city-states and regional confederations that had been incorporated into the Toltec sphere of influence during the period of imperial expansion began asserting greater independence as central authority weakened. Archaeological evidence from these regions shows the construction of new fortifications, the development of independent military capabilities, and changes in material culture that suggest reduced integration with Toltec cultural and economic systems. The emergence of rival power centers in the basin of Mexico represented a particularly serious threat to Toltec authority, as these regions possessed the agricultural resources, population density, and strategic locations necessary to challenge Toltec dominance effectively. Archaeological investigations at sites such as Culhuacan and Azcapotzalco reveal evidence for increased construction activity, military preparation, and the development of independent trade relationships that bypass traditional Toltec commercial networks. The rulers of these communities appear to have taken advantage of Toltec weakness to expand their own territorial control and establish themselves as regional powers capable of competing with the declining imperial system. The competition for control of trade routes and resource sources intensified as multiple groups sought to fill the vacuum created by declining Toltec power. The obsidian quarries that had provided essential raw materials for Toltec tool production became contested territories as various factions attempted to secure access to these valuable resources. Archaeological evidence from quarry sites shows evidence of fortification, conflict, and changing patterns of exploitation that reflect the breakdown of centralized control over resource extraction and distribution. The religious and ideological crisis that accompanied political fragmentation created additional challenges for maintaining social cohesion and legitimate authority throughout former Toltec territories. The theological framework that had legitimized Toltec imperial expansion and political dominance became increasingly difficult to sustain as military defeats, economic failures, and environmental disasters raised questions about divine favor and cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial centers shows reduced participation in traditional rituals, simplified ceremonial equipment, and the abandonment of some religious practices that have been central to Toltec cultural identity. The abandonment of major Toltec centers began during the mid-12th century as communities found it increasingly difficult to maintain large urban populations in the face of agricultural shortages, military threats, and political instability. Archaeological evidence from Tolan Sikokotitlan reveals a gradual process of population decline that accelerated during periods of particular crisis. Residential areas show evidence of abandonment, with houses left empty and gradually stripped of useful materials by remaining inhabitants. The ceremonial centre continued to function at reduced levels, but the elaborate rituals and massive construction projects that had characterised the height of Toltec power were no longer sustainable. The process of urban abandonment was not uniform throughout Toltec territory, with some communities adapting more successfully to changing conditions, while others experienced rapid depopulation and economic collapse. Archaeological investigations reveal that settlements with access to reliable water sources, defensible positions, and diverse economic resources were more likely to maintain viable populations during the crisis period. Communities that had been heavily dependent on tribute income or specialised craft production for regional markets faced greater challenges as these economic systems broke down. Population dispersal from abandoned urban centres created demographic pressures throughout central Mexico as displaced groups sought new homes and economic opportunities in regions that were already experiencing resource shortages. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these population movements were organised migrations led by traditional authorities, while others represented more spontaneous responses to local crises. The integration of the displaced Toltec populations into existing communities created cultural mixing that would influence regional development patterns for centuries after the collapse of imperial political structures. The preservation of Toltec cultural traditions during this period of political fragmentation occurred through various mechanisms that enabled the survival of important knowledge, artistic techniques, and religious practices despite the breakdown of centralized institutions. Archaeological evidence suggests that some priestly families and craft specialists maintained traditional practices in reduced circumstances, while certain communities continued to observe Toltec ceremonial calendars and artistic traditions even after abandoning major urban centers. The transmission of cultural knowledge through family lineages and professional associations ensured that important elements of Toltec civilization would survive to influence later Mesoamerican developments. The archaeological record of Toltec decline reveals a complex pattern of adaptation, resistance, and transformation that defies simple narratives of sudden collapse or gradual decay. Different regions and communities responded to crisis conditions in various ways, with some maintaining modified versions of traditional systems, while others underwent fundamental reorganization. The material culture assemblages from this period show both continuity with earlier Toltec traditions and innovation in response to changing circumstances, indicating that cultural change was a dynamic process rather than simple abandonment of established practices. The legacy of Toltec political and cultural achievements continued to influence Mesoamerican development even as their imperial system fragmented and their major urban centers were abandoned. The architectural innovations, artistic traditions, and religious concepts that had been developed during the height of Toltec power provided models and inspiration for later civilizations throughout central Mexico. The administrative techniques, military technologies, and economic systems that had enabled Toltec expansion were adapted and modified by successor states that built upon Toltec foundations while developing their own distinctive characteristics. The administrative techniques, military technologies, and economic systems that had enabled Toltec expansion were adapted and modified by successor states that built upon Toltec foundations while developing their own distinctive characteristics. Among these inheritors of Toltec tradition, none would prove more influential in reshaping the narrative of Toltec history than the Aztec Empire, whose rulers systematically appropriated Toltec legitimacy to justify their own imperial ambitions and divine authority. The Triple Alliance that emerged in the basin of Mexico during the 15th century constructed elaborate genealogical and mythological connections to the Toltecs that transformed historical memory while establishing political precedents that would govern Mesoamerican imperial ideology until the Spanish conquest. The Aztec appropriation of Toltec history began with deliberate attempts to establish direct dynastic connections to the rulers of Tolan-Xicocoatitlan, despite the chronological gap of nearly 3 centuries between the collapse of Toltec power and the emergence of Aztec dominance. Aztec historical accounts, preserved in codices and oral traditions recorded by Spanish chroniclers, consistently portrayed their rulers as legitimate heirs to Toltec authority who had inherited both the right and responsibility to govern central Mexico according to ancient precedents. These claims were supported through carefully constructed genealogies that traced Aztec royal lineages back to Toltec nobles, while archaeological evidence suggests that actual biological connections were minimal or non-existent. The most significant of these genealogical constructions involved the rulers of Culhuacán, a city-state in the southern basin of Mexico that had maintained some continuity with Toltec traditions during the period of political fragmentation. Aztec historians claimed that Culhuacan's ruling dynasty descended directly from the last Toltec kings, making marriage alliances with Culhuacan families essential for establishing legitimate claims to imperial authority. The Aztec ruler Acamapixtli, founder of the Tenochtitlan dynasty, was said to have been selected specifically because his mother belonged to the Culhuacan royal house, thereby providing the nascent Aztec state with the Toltec bloodline necessary for legitimate rule. Archaeological investigations at Culhuacan have revealed material culture assemblages that show some continuity with Toltec traditions, including ceramic styles, architectural elements, and religious practices that maintained connections to earlier imperial models. However, the evidence suggests that these continuities were more cultural than political, representing the preservation of artistic and religious traditions rather than actual dynastic succession. The Culhuacan rulers who claimed Toltec ancestry appear to have been local leaders who adopted Toltec symbols and practices to enhance their own prestige, rather than legitimate descendants of imperial bloodlines. The transformation of Toltec religious traditions under Aztec patronage created theological frameworks that elevated historical figures to divine status while establishing ritual practices that reinforced imperial ideology. The figure of Acatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl underwent particular elaboration in Aztec religious thought, evolving from a controversial historical ruler into a supreme creator deity whose promised return would herald a new golden age. Aztec priests developed complex mythological cycles that portrayed Quetzalcoatl as the divine architect of human civilization, the inventor of agriculture and learning, and the model for righteous rulership that provided standards against which earthly monarchs could be measured. These mythological elaborations served important political functions by establishing divine precedents for Aztec imperial practices, while creating theological justifications for territorial expansion and tribute collection. The concept of Quetzalcoatl as a culture hero who had brought civilization to humanity provided ideological support for Aztec claims that their conquests were spreading beneficial cultural influences rather than merely extracting resources from subject populations. The association of legitimate rulership with Quetzalcoatl worship created religious obligations that required conquered peoples to acknowledge Aztec authority as divinely sanctioned continuation of ancient Toltec traditions. The architectural programs undertaken by Aztec rulers systematically incorporated Toltec design elements and symbolic motifs that created visual connections to the imperial past, while demonstrating the superior resources and capabilities of the new empire. The Templo Mayor at Tenochtitlan featured sculptural decorations that directly referenced Toltec iconographic traditions, including feathered serpent imagery, warrior symbols, and astronomical alignments that echoed the ceremonial architecture of Toltecs. These architectural references were not mere aesthetic choices, but deliberate political statements that proclaimed Aztec inheritance of Toltec authority, while demonstrating their ability to surpass their predecessors' achievements. The scale and sophistication of Aztec construction projects were explicitly designed to exceed Toltec precedents, creating monumental architecture that impressed viewers with the superior power and divine favour enjoyed by the new imperial system. The Templo Mayor rose to heights that dwarfed the pyramids at Tula, while the urban planning of Tenochtitlan created a ceremonial landscape that surpassed Toltecs in both size and architectural complexity. These achievements were presented not as innovations, but as fulfillment of Toltec potential, suggesting that Aztec rulers had successfully restored the golden age that had been lost with the collapse of the earlier empire. The military traditions that formed the backbone of Aztec imperial expansion drew heavily upon Toltec precedents while adapting ancient practices to new technological and strategic circumstances. The eagle and jaguar warrior societies that had originated during the Toltec period were revived and elaborated under Aztec patronage, with initiation rituals, training programs, and ceremonial regalia that consciously reproduced historical models, while incorporating innovations that reflected centuries of military development. Aztec military manuals and training texts explicitly referenced Toltec tactical principles and strategic concepts, presenting contemporary military practices as restoration of ancient wisdom rather than modern innovation. The weapons and equipment used by Aztec warriors incorporated technological improvements that had been developed since the Toltec period, while maintaining symbolic connections to earlier military traditions. The Macuahuitl, the obsidian edge club that became the signature weapon of Aztec warfare, was presented as a Toltec invention despite archaeological evidence suggesting that its mature form had been developed during the post-Toltec period. Similarly, the Atlatl continued to serve important ceremonial functions in Aztec military culture, long after more effective projectile weapons had been adopted for actual combat, demonstrating the symbolic importance of maintaining connections to Toltec military traditions. The tribute systems that sustained Aztec imperial administration were explicitly modelled on Toltec precedents, with administrative procedures, collection schedules, and tribute categories that reproduced earlier imperial practices while expanding them to unprecedented scales. Aztec tribute lists preserved in colonial documents reference Toltec administrative terminology and organizational principles, while the geographic extent of tribute collection was presented as restoration of ancient imperial boundaries rather than new territorial conquest. The standardization of tribute obligations across diverse ecological and cultural zones followed patterns that had been established during the Toltec period, demonstrating the continuing influence of earlier administrative innovations. The commercial networks that connected Aztec territories throughout Mesoamerica built upon trade routes and commercial relationships that had been established during the Toltec period, with merchant organizations that maintained institutional continuity across centuries of political change. The Pochteca merchant class that served Aztec imperial interests claimed direct descent from Toltec commercial organizations, preserving specialized knowledge, trading practices and diplomatic protocols that had been developed during the earlier imperial period. Archaeological evidence from merchant quarters in Aztec cities reveals material culture assemblages that show clear continuities with Toltec commercial traditions, including specialized storage facilities, standardized weights and measures, and ceremonial objects associated with long-distance trade. The influence of Toltec religious, artistic, and political traditions extended far beyond the Aztec Empire to encompass virtually every major Mesoamerican civilization that emerged during the post-classic period. The Maya city-states of the Yucatan Peninsula maintained architectural and artistic traditions that had been established during the period of Toltec influence at Chichen Itza, with ceremonial centres throughout the region featuring feathered serpent imagery, warrior symbolism, and astronomical alignments that reflected Toltec religious concepts. The continued worship of Kukulkan in Maya communities demonstrated the lasting impact of Toltec theological innovations on regional religious development. The Tarascan Empire of Western Mexico developed political and military institutions that showed clear influences from Toltec models, despite maintaining distinct cultural traditions and linguistic identity. Tarascan royal regalia included feathered ornaments, obsidian weapons, and ceremonial objects that referenced Toltec imperial symbolism, while their capital at Tzintzuntzan featured architectural elements that adapted Toltec design principles to local materials and construction techniques. The administrative systems that governed Tarascan territories employed organizational concepts and bureaucratic procedures that had been pioneered during the Toltec period, demonstrating the continued relevance of earlier imperial innovations. The Huastec peoples of the Gulf Coast region maintained religious and artistic traditions that preserved elements of Toltec cultural influence despite centuries of political independence and cultural development. Archaeological investigations at Huastec sites have revealed ceremonial architecture, sculptural programs, and material culture assemblages that show continuing connections to Toltec artistic traditions, while religious practices documented by Spanish chroniclers included ceremonies and mythological concepts that had been introduced during the period of Toltec expansion. The integration of these foreign elements into distinctively Huastec cultural context demonstrates the selective adoption and adaptation of Toltec innovations by regional populations. The transformation of historical Toltecs into legendary figures occurred through complex processes of cultural transmission that involved both deliberate mythological elaboration and gradual distortion of historical memory over time. The collapse of Toltec political institutions and the abandonment of major urban centres created gaps in historical knowledge that were filled through oral traditions, religious narratives, and political propaganda that gradually transformed historical figures into mythological archetypes. C.E. Acatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl became the most prominent example of this transformation, evolving from a controversial historical ruler into a divine culture hero, whose legendary exploits provided models for righteous leadership and promises of future redemption. The mythological cycles that developed around Toltec history incorporated elements from much older Mesoamerican religious traditions, while adding new themes that reflected the specific historical experiences of post-Toltec populations. The concept of Tollan as a golden age of peace, prosperity, and cultural achievement provided ideological frameworks that could be used to criticize contemporary conditions while promising future restoration of ideal social and political arrangements. These mythological constructions served important psychological and social functions by providing hope during periods of crisis, while establishing standards for evaluating political leadership and social organization. The preservation and transmission of these legendary narratives occurred through various institutional mechanisms that ensured their survival across centuries of political and cultural change. Priestly schools maintained oral traditions and written records that preserved mythological knowledge, while royal courts patronized artists and historians who created visual and literary works that transmitted legendary narratives to new generations. The integration of Toltec mythology into religious ceremonies, political rituals, and educational curricula ensured that these traditions remained vital components of Mesoamerican cultural identity long after their historical origins had been forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. Modern archaeological discoveries have provided increasingly sophisticated understanding of Toltec civilization that both confirms and challenges traditional interpretations of their historical significance and cultural achievements. Excavations at Tollan-Jicocutitlan and other major sites have revealed evidence for urban planning, architectural innovation, and craft specialization that demonstrates the genuine achievements of Toltec civilization while placing these accomplishments within broader contexts of Mesoamerican cultural development. The archaeological record reveals a complex society that combined military expansion with cultural synthesis, creating imperial institutions that influenced regional development while adapting to diverse local conditions and populations. The chronological frameworks established through radiocarbon dating, ceramic analysis, and stratigraphic investigation have provided more precise understanding of Toltec development that clarifies the relationship between historical events and later mythological elaborations. These scientific approaches have revealed that Toltec civilization developed over several centuries through gradual processes of cultural integration and political consolidation, rather than sudden emergence under divine guidance or heroic leadership. The archaeological evidence demonstrates that Toltec achievements resulted from collective efforts by diverse populations rather than the individual genius of legendary rulers, providing more realistic appreciation for the social and economic foundations that supported their cultural innovations. Ongoing scholarly debates about Toltec civilization's true extent and nature reflect both the limitations of available evidence and the complexity of cultural processes that created their distinctive achievements. The geographic boundaries of direct Toltec political control remain difficult to establish with precision, while the mechanisms through which Toltec cultural influence spread throughout Mesoamerica continue to generate competing interpretations among researchers. Some scholars emphasize military conquest and political domination as primary factors in Toltec expansion, while others stress commercial relationships, cultural attraction, and voluntary adoption of Toltec innovations by regional populations. The relationship between archaeological evidence and ethno-historical accounts presents particular challenges for understanding Toltec civilization, as later sources were influenced by political agendas and mythological elaborations that may not accurately reflect historical realities. The integration of scientific archaeological data with traditional historical narratives requires careful evaluation of source reliability and cultural context, while recognition of indigenous perspectives and knowledge systems provides important insights that complement Western academic approaches. These methodological considerations continue to shape research directions and interpretive frameworks that guide contemporary Toltec studies. The significance of Toltec civilization in Mesoamerican history extends far beyond their specific political and cultural achievements to encompass their role as cultural mediators who facilitated the transmission of innovations, ideas, and traditions across vast geographic and temporal distances. Their imperial system created networks of communication and exchange that connected diverse populations while establishing precedents for political organization, religious practice, and artistic expression that would influence regional development for centuries. The collapse of Toltec political power did not end their historical influence, but rather began a new phase of cultural transmission that would ultimately shape the development of every major Mesoamerican civilization that followed. The legacy of Tollan as the archetypal civilized city continued to inspire urban planning and architectural design throughout Mesoamerica, with later rulers consciously attempting to recreate the perceived perfection of the Toltec capital in their own ceremonial centers. This idealization of Toltec urban achievement provided both practical models and symbolic frameworks that guided city planning decisions while establishing standards for evaluating civic accomplishment. The enduring influence of Toltec urban design principles demonstrates the lasting impact of their innovations on Mesoamerican concepts of proper social organization and physical environment. The transformation of Toltec history into mythology created cultural resources that continue to influence Mesoamerican societies long after the Spanish conquest, with indigenous communities maintaining traditions and beliefs that preserved elements of Toltec religious and political thought. Colonial and modern indigenous movements have drawn upon Toltec symbolism and mythology to articulate cultural identity and political resistance. demonstrating the continuing relevance of these ancient traditions for contemporary indigenous peoples. The persistence of Toltec cultural influence across more than a millennium of historical change testifies to the enduring power of their achievements and the universal appeal of their vision of the civilized society. The study of Toltec civilization thus provides crucial insights into the processes of cultural development, imperial expansion, and historical transmission that shaped Mesoamerican history, while offering broader perspectives on the relationship between political power and cultural achievement in human societies. Their legacy demonstrates that historical influence extends far beyond the chronological boundaries of political dominance, creating cultural foundations that continue to shape human experience across generations and centuries. The Toltecs, whether viewed as historical actors or mythological archetypes, remain essential figures for understanding the development of one of the world's great cultural traditions and the enduring human quest for social perfection and cultural achievement.